This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Ana Sofia Simão de Portugal. The Last of the Mohicans by James Fenimore Cooper. Chapter 13. The route taken by Hawkeye lay across those sandy plains, relieved by occasional valleys and swells of land, which had been traversed by their party on the morning of the same day, with baffled Magoo for their guide. The sun had now fallen low toward the distant mountains, and as they journeyed through the interminable forest, the heat was no longer oppressive. Their progress, in consequence, was proportionate, and long before the twilight gathered about them, they had made a good many toilsome miles on their return. The hunter, like the savage whose place he filled, seemed to select among the blind signs of their wild route, with a species of instinct, seldom abating its speed, and never pausing to deliberate. A rapid and oblique glance at the moss on the trees, with an occasional upward gaze toward the setting sun, or a steady but passing look at the direction of the numerous water-courses through which he waded, were sufficient to determine his path and remove his greatest difficulties. In the meantime, the forest began to change its hues, losing that lively green which had embellished its arches in the river light which is the usual precursor of the close of day. While the eyes of the sisters were endeavoring to catch glimpses through the trees of the flood of golden glory which formed a glittering halo around the sun, tinging here and there with ruby streaks, or bordering with narrow edgings of shining yellow, a mass of clouds that lay piled at no great distance above the western hills, Hawkeye turned suddenly, and pointing upward toward the gorgeous heaven, he spoke. "Yonder is the signal given to man to seek his food and natural rest," he said. "Better and wiser would it be if you could understand the signs of nature, and take a lesson from the fowls of the air and the beasts of the field. Our night, however, will soon be over, for with the moon we must be up and moving again. I remember to have fought Maquas, hereways, in the first war in which I ever drew blood from men, and we threw up a work of blocks to keep the ravenous vermin from handling our scalps. If my marks do not fail me, we shall find the place a few rods further to our left." Without waiting for an assent, or indeed for any reply, the sturdy hunter moved boldly into a dense thicket of young chestnuts, shoving aside the branches of the exuberant shoots which nearly covered the ground, like a man who expected, at each step, to discover some object he had formerly known. The recollection of the scout did not deceive him. After penetrating through the bush, matted as it was with briars, for a few hundred feet, he entered an open space that surrounded a low, green hillock, which was crowned by the decayed blockhouse in question. This rude and neglected building was one of those deserted works which, having been thrown up on an emergency, had been abandoned with the appearance of danger, and was now quietly crumbling in the solitude of the forest, neglected and nearly forgotten, like the circumstances which had caused it to be reared. Such memorials of the passage and struggles of men are yet frequent throughout the broad barriers of wilderness which once separate the hostile provinces, and form a species of ruin that are intimately associated with recollections of colonial history, and which are in appropriate keeping with the gloomy character of the surrounding scenery. The roof of bark had long since fallen, and mingled with salt, but huge logs of pine, which had been hastily thrown together, still preserved their relative positions, though one angle of the work had given way under the pressure, and threatened a speedy downfall to the remainder of the rustic edifice. While Hayward and his companions hesitated to approach a building so decayed, Hawkeye and the Indians entered within the low walls, not only without fear, but with obvious interest. While the former surveyed the ruins, both internally and externally, with the curiosity of one whose recollections were reviving at each moment, Chingachgook related to his son, in the language of the Delawares, and with the pride of a conqueror, the brief history of the skirmish which had been fought in his youth in that secluded spot. A strain of melancholy, however, blended with his triumph, rendering his voice, as usually, soft and musical. In the meantime, the sisters gladly dismounted, and prepared to enjoy their halt in the coolness of the evening, and in a security which they believed nothing but beasts of the forest could invade. "Would not our resting place have been more retired, my worthy friend?" demanded the more vigilant Duncan, perceiving that the scout had already finished his short survey. "Had we chosen a spot less known, and one more rarely visited than this?" "Few live who know the blockhouse was ever raised," was the slow and musing answer. "'Tis not often that books are made, and narratives written of such a scrimmage as were here fought between the Mohicans and Mohawks in a war of their own waging. I was then a younger, and went out with the Delawares, because I known they were a scandalized and wronged race. 40 days and 40 nights did the imps crave our blood around this pile of logs, which I designed and partly reared, being, as you'll remember, no Indian myself, but a man without a cross. The Delawares lent themselves to the work, and we made it good, 10 to 20, until our numbers were nearly equal, and then we sallied out upon the hounds, and not a man of them ever got back to tell the fate of his party. Yes, yes, I was then young, and new to the sight of blood, and not relishing the thought that creatures who had spirits like myself should lay on the naked ground, to be torn asunder by beasts, or to bleach in the rains. I buried the dead with my own hands, under that very little hillock where you have placed yourselves. And no bad seat does it make neither, though it be raised by the bones of mortal men." Hayward and sisters arose on the instant from the grassy sepulchre, nor could the two latter, notwithstanding the terrific scenes they had so recently passed through, entirely suppress an emotion of natural horror, when they found themselves in such familiar contact with the grave of the dead Mohawks. The grey light, the gloomy little area of dark grass, surrounded by its border of brush, beyond which the pines rose, in breathing silence, apparently into the very clouds, and the death-like stillness of the vast forest, were all in unison to deepen such a sensation. "They are gone, and they are harmless," continued Hawkeye, waving his hand, with a melancholy smile at their manifest alarm. "They'll never shout the war-whoop, nor strike a blow with the tomahawk again. And of all those who aided in placing them where they lie, Chingachgook and I only are living. The brothers and family of the Mohican formed our war party, and you see before you all that are now left of his race." The eyes of the listeners involuntarily sought the forms of the Indians, with a compassionate interest in their desolate fortune. The dark persons were still to be seen within the shadows of the blockhouse, the son listening to the relation of his father with that sort of intentness which would be created by a narrative that redounded so much to the honor of those whose names he had long revered for their courage and savage virtues. "I had thought the Delawares a pacific people," said Duncan, "and that they never waged war in person, trusting the defense of their hands to those very Mohawks that you slew." "'Tis true in part," returned the scout, "and yet, at bottom, 'tis a wicked lie. Such a treaty was made in ages gone by, through the deviltries of the Dutchers, who wished to disarm the natives that had the best right to the country where they had settled themselves. The Mohicans, though a part of the same nation, having to deal with the English, never entered into the silly bargain, but kept to their manhood, as in truth did the Delawares, when their eyes were opened to their folly. You see before you a chief of the great Mohican sagamores. Once his family could chase their deer over tracts of country wider than that which belongs to the Albany pattern, without crossing brook or hill that was not their own. But what is left of their descendant? He may find these 6 feet of earth when God chooses, and keep it in peace perhaps, if he has a friend who will take the pains to sink his head so low that the plowshares cannot reach it. Enough, said Hayward, apprehensive that the subject might lead to a discussion that would interrupt the harmony so necessary to the preservation of his fair companions. We have journeyed far, and few among us are blessed with forms like that of yours, which seems to know neither fatigue nor weakness. The sinews and bones of a man carry me through it all, said the hunter, surveying his muscular limbs with a simplicity that betrayed the honest pleasure the compliment afforded him. There are larger and heavier men to be found in the settlements, but you might travel many days in a city before you could meet one able to walk 50 miles without stopping to take breath, or who has kept the hounds within hearing during a chase of hours. However, as flesh and blood are not always the same, it is quite reasonable to suppose that the gentle ones are willing to rest, after all they have seen and done this day. Uncas, clear out the spring, while your father and I make a cover for their tender heads of these chitinous shoots and a bed of grass and leaves. The dialogue ceased, while the hunter and his companions busied themselves in preparations for the comfort and protection of those they guided. A spring, which many long years before had induced the natives to select the place for their temporary fortification, was soon cleared of leaves, and a fountain of crystal gushed from the bed, diffusing its water over the verdant hillock. A corner of the building was then roofed in such a manner as to exclude the heavy dew of the climate, and paths of sweet shrubs and dry leaves were laid beneath it for the sisters to repose on. While the diligent woodsmen were employed in this manner, Cora and Alice partook of the refreshment which duty required much more than inclination prompted them to accept. They then retired within the walls, and first offering up their thanksgiving for past mercies, and petitioning for a continuance of the divine favor throughout the coming night, they laid their tender forms on the fragrant couch, and in spite of recollections and forebodings, soon sank into those slumbers which nature so imperiously demanded, and which were sweetened by hopes for the morrow. Duncan had prepared himself to pass the night in watchfulness near them, just without the ruin, but the scout, perceiving his intention, pointed toward Chingachgook, as he coolly disposed his own person on the grass, and said, "The eyes of a white man are too heavy and too blind for such a watch as this. The Mohican will be our sentinel, therefore let us sleep." "I proved myself a sluggard on my post during the past night," said Hayward, "and have less need of repose than you, who did more credit to the character of a soldier. Let all the party seek their rest, then, while I hold the guard." "If we lay among the white tents of the 60th, and in front of an enemy like the French, I could not ask for a better watchman," returned the scout. "But in the darkness, and among the signs of the wilderness, your judgment would be like the folly of a child, and your vigilance thrown away. Do then, like Uncas and myself, sleep, and sleep in safety." Hayward perceived, in truth, that the younger Indian had thrown his form on the side of the hillock while they were talking, like one who thought to make the most of the time allotted to rest, and that this example had been followed by David, whose voice literally clove to his jaws, with fever of his wound, highlighted, as it was, by their toilsome march. Unwilling to prolong a useless discussion, the young man affected to comply, by posting his back against the logs of the blockhouse in a half-recumbent posture, though resolutely determined in his own mind not to close an eye until he had delivered his precious charge into the arms of Munro himself. Hawkeye, believing he had prevailed, soon fell asleep, and the silence, as deep as the solitude in which they had found it, pervaded the retired spot. For many minutes Duncan succeeded in keeping his senses on the alert, and alive to every morning sound that arose from the forest. His vision became more acute as the shades of evening settled on the place, and even after the stars were glimmering above his head, he was able to distinguish the recumbent forms of his companions as they lay stretched on the grass, and to note the person of Chingachgook, who sat upright and motionless as one of the trees which formed the dark barrier on every side. He still heard the gentle breathings of the sisters, who lay within a few feet of him, and not a leaf was ruffled by the passing air of which his ear did not detect the whispering sound. At length, however, the mournful notes of a whip-poor-will became blended with moanings of an owl. His heavy eyes occasionally sought the bright rays of the stars, and he then fancied he saw them through the fallen lids. At instants of momentary wakefulness, he mistook a bush for his associate sentinel. His head next sank upon his shoulder, which, in its turn, sought the support of the ground, and finally his whole person became relaxed and pliant, and the young man sank into deep sleep, dreaming that he was a knight of ancient chivalry, holding his midnight vigils before the tent of a recaptured princess, whose favour he did not despair of gaining by such a proof of devotion and watchfulness. How long the tired Duncan lay in this insensible state he never knew himself, but his slumbering visions had been long lost in total forgetfulness, when he was awakened by a light tap on the shoulder. Aroused by this signal, slight as it was, he sprang upon his feet with a confused recollection of the self-imposed duty he had assumed with the commencement of the night. "Who comes?" he demanded, feeling for his sword at the place where it was usually suspended. "Speak! Friend or enemy?" "Friend," replied the low voice of Chingachgook, who, pointing upward at the luminary which was shedding its mild light through the opening in the trees directly into their bivouac, immediately added, in his rude English, "Moon comes, and white men's far off. Time to move, when sleep shuts both eyes of the Frenchman." "You say true. Call up your friends, and bridle the horses while I prepare my own companions for the march." "We are awake, Duncan," said the soft, silvery tones of Alice within the building, "and ready to travel very fast after so refreshing a sleep. But we have watched through the tedious night in our behalf, after having endured so much fatigue the livelong day." "Say, rather, I would have watched, but my treacherous eyes betrayed me. Twice I have proved myself unfit for the trust I bear." "Nay, Duncan, deny it not," interrupted smiling Alice, issuing from the shadows of the building into the light of the moon in all the loveliness of her refreshed beauty. "I know you to be a heedless one, when self is the object of your care, and but too vigilant in favour of others. Can you not tarry here a little longer while you find the rest you need? Cheerfully, most cheerfully, will Cor and I keep the vigils, while you and all these brave men endeavour to snatch a little sleep." "If shame could cure me of my drowsiness, I should never close an eye again," said the uneasy youth, gazing at the ingenuous countenance of Alice, where, however, in its sweet solicitude, he read nothing to confirm his half-awakened suspicion. "It is but true that after leading you into danger by my idleness, I have not even the merit of guarding your pillows as should become a soldier." "No one but Duncan himself should accuse Duncan of such a weakness. Go, then, and sleep. Believe me, neither of us, weak girls as we are, will betray our watch." The young man was relieved from the awkwardness of making any further protestations of his own demerits by an exclamation from Chingachgook, and the attitude of riveted attention assumed by his son. "The Mohicans are an enemy," whispered Hawkeye, who, by this time, in common with the whole party, was awake and stirring. "They scent danger in the wind." "God forbid!" exclaimed Hayward. "Surely we have had enough of bloodshed." While he spoke, however, the young soldier seized his rifle, and advancing toward the front, prepared to atone for his venial remissness by freely exposing his life in defense of those he attended. "'Tis some creature of the forest prowling around us in quest of food," he said in a whisper as soon as the low and apparently distant sounds which had startled the Mohicans reached his own ears. "Hist!" returned the attentive scout. "'Tis man. Even I can now tell his tread, poor as my senses are when compared to an Indian's. That scampering Huron has fallen in with one of Montcalm's outlying parties, and they have struck up on our trail. I shouldn't like myself to spill more blood in this spot," he added, looking around with anxiety in his features at the dim objects by which he was surrounded. "But what must be, must. Lead horses into the blockhouse, Uncas. And, friends, do you follow to the same shelter. Poor and old as it is, it offers a cover, and has rung with the crack of a rifle afore tonight." He was instantly obeyed, the Mohicans leading the Narragansetts within the ruin, whither the whole party repaired with the most guarded silence. The sound of approaching footsteps were now too distinctly audible to leave any doubts as to the nature of the interruption. They were soon mingled with voices calling to each other in an Indian dialect, which the hunter, in a whisper, affirmed to Hayward was the language of the Hurons. When the party reached the point where the horses had entered the thicket which surrounded the blockhouse, they were evidently at fault, having lost those marks which, until that moment, had directed their pursuit. It would seem by the voices that 20 men were soon collected at that one spot, mingling their different opinions and advice in noisy clamor. "The knaves know our weakness," whispered Hawkeye, who stood by the side of Hayward in deep shade, looking through an opening in the logs. "Or they wouldn't indulge their idleness in such a squaw's march. Listen to the reptiles. Each man among them seems to have 2 tongues and but a single leg." Duncan, brave as he was in the combat, could not, in such a moment of painful suspense, make any replies to the cool and characteristic remark of the scout. He only grasped his rifle more firmly, and fastened his eyes upon the narrow opening, through which he gazed upon the moonlight view with increasing anxiety. The deeper tones of one who spoke as having authority were next heard, amid a silence that denoted the respect with which his order, or rather advice, was received. After which, by the rustling of leaves and crackling of dry twigs, it was apparent the savages were separating in pursuit of the lost trail. Fortunately for the pursued, the light of the moon, while it shed a flood of mild lustre upon the little area round the ruin, was not sufficiently strong to penetrate the deep arches of the forest, where the objects still lay in deceptive shadow. The search proved fruitless, for so short and sudden had been the passage from the faint path the travellers had journeyed into the thicket, that every trace of their footsteps was lost in the obscurity of the woods. It was not long, however, before the restless savages were heard beating the brush, and gradually approaching the inner edge of that dense border of young chestnuts which encircled the little area. "They are coming," muttered Hayward, endeavoring to thrust his rifle through the chink in the logs. "Let us fire on their approach." keep everything in shade," returned the scout. "The snapping of a flint, or even the smell of a single kernel of the brimstone, would bring the hungry varlets upon us in a body. Should it please God that we must give battle for the scalps, trust to the experience of men who know the ways of the savages, and who are not often backward when the war whoop is howled." Duncan cast his eyes behind him, and saw that the trembling sisters were cowering in the far corner of the building, while the Mohicans stood in shadow, like two upright posts, ready, and apparently willing, to strike when the blow should be needed. Curbing his impatience, he again looked out upon the area, and awaited the result in silence. At that instant the thicket opened, and the tall unarmed Huron advanced a few paces into the open space. As he gazed upon the silent blockhouse, the moon fell upon his swarthy countenance, and betrayed its surprise and curiosity. He made the exclamation which usually accompanies the former emotion in an Indian, and, calling in a low voice, soon drew a companion to his side. These children of the woods stood together for several moments, pointing at the crumbling edifice, and conversing in the unintelligible language of their tribe. They then approached, though with slow and cautious steps, pausing every instant to look at the building, like startled deer whose curiosity struggled powerfully with their awkward apprehensions for the mastery. The foot of one of them suddenly rested on the mound, and he stopped to examine its nature. At this moment, Hayward observed that the scout loosened his knife in its sheath, and lowered the muzzle of his rifle. Imitating these movements, the young man prepared himself for the struggle which now seemed inevitable. The savages were so near that the least motion in one of the horses, or even a breath louder than common, would have betrayed the fugitives. But in discovering the character of the mound, the attention of the Hurons appeared directed to a different object. They spoke together, and the sounds of their voices were low and solemn, as if influenced by reverence that was deeply blended with awe. Then they drew warily back, keeping their eyes riveted on the ruin, as if they expected to see the apparitions of the dead issue from its silent walls, until, having reached the boundary of the area, they moved slowly into the thicket and disappeared. Hawkeye dropped the breech of his rifle to the earth, and drawing a long, free breath, exclaimed in an audible whisper, "Hey! They respect the dead, and it has this time saved their own lives, and, it may be, the lives of better men too." Hayward lent his attention for a single moment to his companion, but without replying, he again turned toward those who just then interested him more. He heard the two Hurons leave the bushes, and it was soon plain that all the pursuers were gathered about them, in deep attention to their report. After a few minutes of earnest and solemn dialogue, altogether different from the noisy clamor with which they had first collected about the spot, the sounds grew fainter and more distant, and finally were lost in the depths of the forest. Hawkeye waited until a signal from the listening Chingachgook assured him that every sound from the retiring party was completely swallowed by the distance, when he motioned to Hayward to lead forth the horses, and to assist the sisters into their saddles. The instant this was done, they issued through the broken gateway, and stealing out by a direction opposite to the one by which they entered, they quitted the spot, the sisters casting furtive glances at the silent, grave and crumbling ruin, as they left the soft light of the moon to bury themselves in the gloom of the woods. End of chapter 13.
This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For further information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Last of the Mohicans by James Fenimore Cooper. Chapter 14. Garde! Qui est là? Pucelle, Paysans, pauvres gens de France. King Henry VI. During the rapid movement from the blockhouse, and until the party was deeply buried in the forest, each individual was too much interested in the escape to hazard a word, even in whispers. The scout resumed his post in the advance, though his steps, after he had thrown a safe distance between himself and his enemies, were more deliberate than in their previous march, in consequence of his utter ignorance of the localities of the surrounding woods. More than once he halted to consult with his confederates, the Mohicans, pointing upwards at the moon and examining the barks of the trees with care. In these brief pauses Heyward and the sisters listened, with senses rendered doubly acute by the danger, to detect any symptoms which might announce the proximity of their foes. At such moments it seemed as if a vast range of country lay buried in eternal sleep, not the least sound arising from the forest, unless it was the distant and scarcely audible rippling of a watercourse. Birds, beasts, and man appeared to slumber alike, if indeed any of the latter were to be found in that wide tract of wilderness. But the sounds of the rivulet, feeble and murmuring as they were, relieved the guides at once from no trifling embarrassment, and towards it they immediately held their way. When the banks of the little stream were gained, Hawkeye made another halt, and taking the moccasins from his feet, he invited Heyward and Gamut to follow his example. He then entered the water, and for near an hour they travelled in the bed of the brook, leaving no trail. The moon had already sunk into an immense pile of black clouds, which lay impending above the western horizon, when they issued from the low and devious watercourse, to rise again to the light and level of the sandy but wooded plain. Here the scout seemed to be once more at home, for he held on his way, with the certainty and diligence of a man who moved in the security of his own knowledge. The path soon became more uneven, and the travellers could plainly perceive that the mountains drew nigher to them on each hand, and that they were, in truth, about entering one of their gorges. Suddenly Hawkeye made a pause, and waiting until he was joined by the whole party, he spoke, though in tones so low and cautious that they added to the solemnity of his words in the quiet and darkness of the place. "It is easy to know the pathways, and to find the licks and watercourses of the wilderness," he said, "but who that saw this spot could venture to say that a mighty army was at rest among yonder silent trees and barren mountains?" "We are then at no great distance from William Henry," said Heyward, advancing nigher to the scout. "It is yet a long and weary path, and when and where to strike it is now our greatest difficulty. See," he said, pointing through the trees towards a spot where a little basin of water reflected the stars from its placid bosom, "here is the Bloody Pond, and I am on ground that I have not only often travelled, but over which I have fought the enemy from the rising to the setting sun. Ha! that sheet of dull and dreary water, then, is the sepulchre of the brave men who fell in the contest. I have heard it named, but never have I stood on its banks before. 3 battles did we make with the Dutch Frenchmen. Note, Baron Dieskau, a German in the service of France. A few years previously to the period of the tale, this officer was defeated by Sir William Johnson of Johnstown, New York, on the shores of Lake George. 3 battles did we make with the Dutch Frenchmen in a day," continued Hawkeye, pursuing the train of his own thoughts, rather than replying to the remark of Duncan. "He met us hard by in our outward march to ambush his advance, and scattered us, like driven deer through the defile, to the shores of Horican. Then we rallied behind our fallen trees, and made head against him under Sir William, who was made Sir William for that very deed, and well did we pay him for the disgrace of the morning. Hundreds of Frenchmen saw the sun that day for the last time, and even their leader, Dieskau himself, fell into our hands so cut and torn with the lead that he has gone back to his own country, unfit for further acts in war. "'Twas a noble repulse!" exclaimed Hayward in the heat of his youthful ardour. "The fame of it reached us early in our Southern army." "Ay, but it did not end there. I was sent by Major Effingham, at Sir William's own bidding, to outflank the French, and carry the tidings of their disaster across the portage to the fort on the Hudson. Just hereaway, where you see the trees rise into a mountain swell, I met a party coming down to our aid, and I led them where the enemy were taking their meal, little dreaming that they had not finished the bloody work of the day." "And you surprised them?" "If death can be a surprise to men who are thinking only of the cravings of their appetites. We gave them but little breathing time, for they had borne hard upon us in the fight of the morning, and there were few in our party who had not lost friend or relative by their hands. When all was over, the dead, and some say the dying, were cast into that little pond. These eyes have seen its waters coloured with blood as natural water never yet flowed from the bowels of the earth. It was a convenient, and I trust will prove a peaceful grave for a soldier. You have, then, seen much service on this frontier?" "Ay," said the scout, erecting his tall person with an air of military pride. "There are not many echoes among these hills that haven't rung with the crack of my rifle, nor is there the space of a square mile atwixt Horican and the river that Killdeer hasn't dropped a living body on, be it an enemy or be it a brute beast. As for the grave there being as quiet as you mention, it is another matter. There are them in the camp who say and think man, to lie still, should not be buried while the breath is in the body, and certain it is that in the hurry of that evening the doctors had but little time to say who was living and who was dead. Hist! See you nothing walking on the shore of the pond? 'Tis not probable that any are as houseless as ourselves in this dreary forest." "Such as he may care but little for house or shelter, and night dew can never wet a body that passes its days in the water," returned the scout, grasping the shoulder of Hayward with such convulsive strength as to make the young soldier painfully sensible how much superstitious terror had got the mastery of a man usually so dauntless. "By heaven, there is a human form, and it approaches! Stand to your arms, my friend, for we know not whom we encounter." "Qui vive?" demanded a stern, quick voice, which sounded like a challenge from another world, issuing out of that solitary and solemn place. "Who says it?" whispered the scout. "It speaks neither Indian nor English." "Qui vive?" repeated the same voice, which was quickly followed by the rattling of arms and a menacing attitude. "France!" cried Hayward, advancing from the shadow of the trees to the shore of the pond, within a few yards of the sentinel. "D'où venez-vous? Où allez-vous, d'aussi bonne heure?" demanded the grenadier, in the language and with the accent of a man from old France. "Je viens de la découverte, et je vais me coucher." "Êtes-vous officier du roi?" "Sans doute, mon camarade. Me prends-tu pour un provincial? Je suis capitaine de chasseurs." Hayward well knew that the other was of a regiment in the line. "J'ai ici avec moi les filles du commandant de la fortification. Ah, tu en as entendu parler. Je les ai fait prisonnières près de l'autre fort, et je les conduis au général." "Ma foi, mesdames, j'en suis fâché pour vous," exclaimed the young soldier, touching his cap with grace. "Mais, fortune de guerre, vous trouverez notre général un brave homme, et bien poli avec les dames." "C'est le caractère des gens de guerre," said Cora, with admirable self-possession. "Adieu, mon ami. Je vous souhaiterais un devoir plus agréable à remplir." The soldier made a low and humble acknowledgment for her civility, and Hayward adding a bonne nuit, mon camarade, they moved deliberately forward, leaving the sentinel pacing the banks of the silent pond, little suspecting an enemy of so much effrontery, and humming to himself those words which were recalled to his mind by the sight of the women, and perhaps by recollections of his own distant and beautiful France. Vive le vin, vive la mort. "'Tis well you understood the knave," whispered the scout, when they had gained a little distance from the place, and letting his rifle fall into the hollow of his arm again. "I soon saw that he was one of them uneasy Frenchers, and well for him it was that his speech was friendly and his wishes kind, or a place might have been found for his bones amongst those of his countrymen." He was interrupted by a long and heavy groan, which arose from the little basin, as though in truth the spirits of the departed lingered about their watery sepulchre. "Surely it was of flesh," continued the scout. "No spirit could handle its arms so steadily." "It was of flesh, but whether the poor fellow still belongs to this world may well be doubted," said Heyward, glancing his eyes around him, and missing Chingachgook from their little band. Another groan, more faint than the former, was succeeded by a heavy and sullen plunge into the water, and all was as still again as if the borders of the dreary pool had never been awakened from the silence of creation. While they yet hesitated in uncertainty, the form of the Indian was seen gliding out of the thicket. As the chief rejoined them, with one hand he attached the reeking scalp of the unfortunate young Frenchman to his girdle, and with the other he replaced the knife and tomahawk that had drunk his blood. He then took his wonted station with the air of a man who believed he had done a deed of merit. The scout dropped one end of his rifle to the earth, and leaning his hands on the other, he stood musing in profound silence. Then, shaking his head in a mournful manner, he muttered, "'Twould have been a cruel and an inhuman act for a white skin, but 'tis the gift and nature of an Indian, and I suppose it should not be denied. I could wish, though, it had befallen an accursed Mingo, rather than that gay young boy from the old countries." "Enough," said Heyward, apprehensive the unconscious sisters might comprehend the nature of the detention, and conquering his disgust by a train of reflections very much like that of the hunter. "'Tis done, and though better it were left undone, cannot be amended. You see we are too obviously within the sentinels of the enemy. What course do you propose to follow?" "Yes," said Hawkeye, rousing himself again. "'Tis, as you say, too late to harbour further thoughts about it. Ay, the French have gathered round the fort in good earnest, and we have a delicate needle to thread in passing them." "And but little time to do it in," added Heyward, glancing his eyes upwards towards the bank of vapour that concealed the setting moon. "And little time to do it in," repeated the scout. "The thing may be done in two fashions by the help of Providence, without which it may not be done at all." "Name them quickly, for time presses." "One would be to dismount the gentle ones, and let their beasts range the plain. By sending the Mohicans in front, we might then cut a lane through their sentries, and enter the fort over the dead bodies." "It will not do, it will not do," interrupted the generous Heyward. "A soldier might force his way in this manner, but never with such a convoy." "'Twould be indeed a bloody path for such tender feet to wade in," returned the equally reluctant scout, "but I thought it befitting my manhood to name it. We must then turn on our trail, and get without the line of their lookouts, when we will bend short to the west, and enter the mountains, where I can hide you, so that all the devil's hounds in Montcalm's pay would be thrown off the scent for months to come. Let it be done, and that instantly." Further words were unnecessary, for Hawkeye, merely uttering the mandate to "follow," moved along the route by which they had just entered their present critical and even dangerous situation. Their progress, like their late dialogue, was guarded and without noise, for none knew at what moment a passing patrol or a crouching picket of the enemy might rise upon their path. As they held their silent way along the margin of the pond, again Heyward and the scout stole furtive glances at its appalling dreariness. They looked in vain for the form they had so recently seen stalking along its silent shores, while a low and regular wash of the little waves, by announcing that the waters were not yet subsided, furnished a frightful memorial of the deed of blood they had just witnessed. Like all that passing and gloomy scene, the low basin, however, quickly melted in the darkness, and became blended with a mass of black objects in the rear of the travellers. Hawkeye soon deviated from the line of their retreat. and striking off towards the mountains which form the western boundary of the narrow plain, he led his followers with swift steps deep within the shadows that were cast from their high and broken summits. The route was now painful, lying over ground ragged with rocks and intersected with ravines, and their progress proportionately slow. Bleak and black hills lay on every side of them, compensating in some degree for the additional toil of the march by the sense of security they imparted. At length the party began slowly to rise a steep and rugged ascent, by a path that curiously wound among rocks and trees, avoiding the one and supported by the other, in a manner that showed it had been devised by men long practised in the arts of the wilderness. As they gradually rose from the level of the valleys, the thick darkness which usually precedes the approach of day began to disperse, and objects were seen in the plain and palpable colours with which they had been gifted by nature. When they issued from the stunted woods which clung to the barren sides of the mountain, upon a flat and mossy rock that formed its summit, they met the morning as it came blushing above the green pines of a hill that lay on the opposite side of the valley of the Horican. The scout now told the sisters to dismount, and taking the bridles from the mouths and the saddles off the backs of the jaded beasts, he turned them loose to glean a scanty subsistence among the shrubs and meagre herbage of that elevated region. "Go," he said, "and seek your food when nature gives it you, and beware that you become not food to ravenous wolves yourselves among these hills." "Have we no further need of them?" demanded Heyward. "See and judge with your own eyes," said the scout, advancing towards the eastern brow of the mountain, whither he beckoned for the whole party to follow. "If it was as easy to look into the heart of man as it is to spy out the nakedness of Montcalm's camp from this spot, hypocrites would grow scarce, and the cunning of a Mingo might prove a losing game compared to the honesty of a Delaware." When the travellers reached the verge of the precipice, they saw at a glance the truth of the scout's declaration, and the admirable foresight with which he had led them to their commanding station. The mountain on which they stood, elevated perhaps 1,000 feet in the air, was a high cone that rose a little in advance of that range which stretches for miles along the western shores of the lake, until, meeting its sister piles beyond the water, it ran off towards the Canadas, in confused and broken masses of rock, thinly sprinkled with evergreens. Immediately at the feet of the party, the southern shore of the Horican swept in a broad semicircle from mountain to mountain, marking a wide strand that soon rose into an uneven and somewhat elevated plain. To the north stretched the limpid, and as it appeared from that dizzy height, the narrow sheet of the Holy Lake, indented with numberless bays, embellished by fantastic headlands, and dotted with countless islands. At the distance of a few leagues, the bed of the waters became lost among mountains, or was wrapped in the masses of vapour that came slowly rolling along their bosom before a light morning air. But a narrow opening between the crests of the hills pointed out the passage by which they found their way still further north, to spread their pure and ample sheets again before pouring out their tribute into the distant Champlain. To the south stretched the defile, a rather broken plain so often mentioned. For several miles in this direction the mountains appeared reluctant to yield their dominion, but within reach of the eye they diverged, and finally melted into the level and sandy lands across which we have accompanied our adventurers in their double journey. Along both ranges of hills which bounded the opposite sides of the lake and valley, clouds of light vapour were rising in spiral wreaths from the uninhabited woods, looking like the smokes of hidden cottages, or rolled lazily down the declivities to mingle with the fogs of the lower land. A single solitary snow-white cloud floated above the valley and marked the spot beneath which lay the silent pool of the Bloody Pond. Directly on the shore of the lake, and nearer to its western than to its eastern margin, lay the extensive earthen ramparts and low buildings of William Henry. Two of the sweeping bastions appeared to rest on the water, which washed their bases. while a deep ditch and extensive morasses guarded its other sides and angles. The land had been cleared of wood for a reasonable distance around the work, but every other part of the scene lay in the green livery of nature, except where the limpid water mellowed the view, or the bold rocks thrust their black and naked heads above the undulating outline of the mountain ranges. In its front might be seen the scattered sentinels, who held a weary watch against their numerous foes, and within the walls themselves the travellers looked down upon men still drowsy with a night of vigilance. Towards the southeast, but in immediate contact with the fort, was an entrenched camp posted on a rocky eminence that would have been far more eligible for the work itself, in which Hawkeye pointed out the presence of those auxiliary regiments that had so recently left the Hudson in their company. From the woods, a little further to the south, rose numerous dark and lurid smokes that were easily to be distinguished from the purer exhalations of the springs, and which the scout also showed to Heyward as evidences that the enemy lay in force in that direction. But the spectacle which most concerned the young soldier was on the western bank of the lake, though quite near to its southern termination, on a strip of land which appeared, from his stand, too narrow to contain such an army, but which in truth extended many hundreds of yards from the shores of the Horican to the base of the mountain, were to be seen the white tents and military engines of an encampment of 10,000 men. Batteries were already thrown up in their front, and even while the spectators above them were looking down with such different emotions on a scene which lay like a map beneath their feet, the roar of artillery rose from the valley and passed off in thundering echoes along the eastern hills. "Morning is just touching them below," said the deliberate and musing scout, "and the watchers have a mind to wake up the sleepers by the sound of cannon. We are a few hours too late. Montcalm has already filled the woods with his accursed Iroquois." "The place is indeed invested," returned Duncan, "but is there no expedient by which we may enter? Capturing the works would be far preferable to falling again into the hands of roving Indians." "See!" exclaimed the scout, unconsciously directing the attention of Cora to the quarters of her own father, "how that shot has made the stones fly from the side of the commandant's house. Ay, these Frenchers will pull it to pieces faster than it was put together, solid and thick though it be." "Heyward, I sicken at the sight of danger that I cannot share," said the undaunted but anxious daughter. "Let us go to Montcalm and demand admission. He dare not deny a child the boon." "You would scarce find the tent of the Frenchman with the hair on your head," said the blunt scout. "If I had but one of the 1,000 boats which lie empty along that shore, it might be done. Ha! here will soon be an end of the firing, for yonder comes a fog that will turn day to night, and make an Indian arrow more dangerous than a moulded cannon. Now, if you are equal to the work and will follow, I will make a push, for I long to get down into that camp, if it be only to scatter some Mingo dogs that I see lurking in the skirts of yonder thicket of birch." "We are equal," said Cora firmly. "On such an errand we will follow to any danger." The scout turned to her with a smile of honest and cordial approbation, as he answered: "I would I had 1,000 men of brawny limbs and quick eyes that feared death as little as you. I'd send them jabbering Frenchers back into their den again, afore the week was ended, howling like so many fettered hounds or hungry wolves. But stir," he added, turning from her to the rest of the party. "The fog comes rolling down so fast we shall have but just the time to meet it on the plain and use it as a cover. Remember, if any accident should befall me, to keep the air blowing on your left cheeks, or rather follow the Mohicans. They'd scent their way, be it in day or be it at night." He then waved his hand for them to follow, and threw himself down the steep declivity with free but careful footsteps. Heyward assisted the sisters to descend, and in a few minutes they were all far down a mountain whose sides they had climbed with so much toil and pain. The direction taken by Hawkeye soon brought the travellers to the level of the plain, nearly opposite to a sally port in the western curtain of the fort, which lay itself at the distance of about half a mile from the point where he halted to allow Duncan to come up with his charge. In their eagerness, and favoured by the nature of the ground, they had anticipated the fog, which was rolling heavily down the lake, and it became necessary to pause until the mists had wrapped the camp of the enemy in their fleecy mantle. The Mohicans profited by the delay to steal out of the woods and to make a survey of the surrounding objects. They were followed at a little distance by the scout, with a view to profit early by their report, and to obtain some faint knowledge for himself of the more immediate localities. In a very few moments he returned, his face reddened with vexation, while he muttered his disappointment in words of no very gentle import. "Here has the cunning Frenchman been posting a picket directly in our path," he said, "redskins and whites, and we shall be as likely to fall into their midst as to pass them in the fog." "Cannot we make a circuit to avoid the danger?" asked Heyward, "and come into our path again when it is past?" "Who that once bends from the line of his march in a fog can tell when or how to turn to find it again? The mists of Horican are not like the curls from a peace pipe, or the smoke which settles above a mosquito fire." He was yet speaking when a crashing sound was heard, and a cannon ball entered the thicket, striking the body of a sapling, and rebounding to the earth, its force being too much expended by previous resistance. The Indians followed instantly, like busy attendants on the terrible messenger, and Uncas commenced speaking earnestly, and with much action, in the Delaware tongue. "It may be so, lad," muttered the scout, when he had ended, "for desperate fevers are not to be treated like a toothache. Come, then, the fog is shutting in." "Stop!" cried Heyward; "first explain your expectations." "'Tis soon done, and a small hope it is, but it is better than nothing. This shot that you see," added the scout, kicking the harmless iron with his foot, "has ploughed the earth in its road from the fort, and we shall hunt for the furrow it has made when all other signs may fail. No more words, but follow, or the fog may leave us in the middle of our path a mark for both armies to shoot at." Heyward, perceiving that in fact a crisis had arrived when acts were more required than words, placed himself between the sisters, and drew them swiftly forward, keeping the dim figure of their leader in his eye. It was soon apparent that Hawkeye had not magnified the power of the fog, for before they had proceeded 20 yards, it was difficult for the different individuals of the party to distinguish each other in the vapor. They had made their little circuit to the left, and were already inclining again towards the right, having, as Heyward thought, got over nearly half the distance to the friendly works, when his ears were saluted with the fierce summons, apparently within 20 feet of them, of "Qui va là?" "Push on!" whispered the scout, once more bending to the left. "Push on!" repeated Heyward, when the summons was renewed by a dozen voices, each of which seemed charged with menace. "C'est moi!" cried Duncan, dragging rather than leading those he supported swiftly onward. "Bête! Qui? Moi? Ami de la France! Tu m'as plus l'air d'un ennemi de la France. Arrête, ou par Dieu je te ferai ami du diable. Non, feu, camarade, feu!" The order was instantly obeyed, and the fog was stirred by the explosion of 50 muskets. Happily the aim was bad, and the bullets cut the air in a direction a little different from that taken by the fugitives, though still so nigh them that, to the unpractised ears of David and the two females, it appeared as if they whistled within a few inches of the organs. The outcry was renewed, and the order not only to fire again, but to pursue, was too plainly audible. When Heyward briefly explained the meaning of the words they heard, Hawkeye halted, and spoke with quick decision and great firmness. "Let us deliver our fire," he said. "They will believe it a sortie and give way, or they will wait for reinforcements." The scheme was well conceived, but failed in its effect. The instant the French heard the pieces, it seemed as if the plain was alive with men, muskets rattling along its whole extent, from the shores of the lake to the furthest boundary of the woods. "We shall draw their entire army upon us, and bring on a general assault," said Duncan. "Lead on, my friend, for your own life and ours." The scout seemed willing to comply, but in the hurry of the moment, and in the change of position, he had lost the direction. In vain he turned either cheek towards the light air; they felt equally cool. In this dilemma Uncas lighted on the furrow of the cannon ball, where it had cut the ground in 3 adjacent ant hills. "Give me the reins," said Hawkeye. bending to catch a glimpse of the direction, and then instantly moving onward. Cries, oaths, voices calling to each other, and the reports of muskets were now quick and incessant, and apparently on every side of them. Suddenly a strong glare of light flashed across the scene, the fog rolled upwards in thick wreaths, and several cannon belched across the plain, and the roar was thrown heavily back from the bellowing echoes of the mountain. "'Tis from the fort!" exclaimed Hawkeye, turning short on his tracks, and we, like stricken fools, were rushing to the woods, under the very knives of the massacre. The instant their mistake was rectified, the whole party retraced the error with the utmost diligence. Duncan willingly relinquished the support of Cora to the arm of Uncas, and Cora as readily accepted the welcome assistance. Men, hot and angry in pursuit, were evidently on their footsteps, and each instant threatened their capture, if not their destruction. "Point de quartier aux coquins!" cried an eager pursuer, who seemed to direct the operations of the enemy. "Stand firm and be ready, my gallant 60ths!" suddenly exclaimed a voice above them. "Wait to see the enemy. Fire low and sweep the glacis." "Father! Father!" exclaimed a piercing cry from out the mist. "It is I, Alice, thy own Elsie! Spare, oh, save your daughters!" "Hold!" shouted the former speaker, in the awful tones of parental agony, the sound reaching even to the woods, and rolling back in solemn echo. "'Tis she! God has restored me my children! Throw open the sally ports! To the field, 60ths, to the field! Pull not a trigger, lest ye kill my lambs! Drive off these dogs of France with your steel!" Duncan heard the grating of the rusty hinges, and darting to the spot directed by the sound, he met a long line of dark red warriors passing swiftly towards the glacis. He knew them for his own battalion of the Royal Americans, and flying to their head, soon swept every trace of his pursuers from before the works. For an instant Cora and Alice had stood trembling and bewildered by this unexpected desertion, but before either had leisure for speech, or even thought, an officer of gigantic frame, whose locks were bleached with years and service, but whose air of military grandeur had been rather softened and destroyed by time, rushed out of the body of the mist, and folded them to his bosom, while large scalding tears rolled down his pale and wrinkled cheeks, and he exclaimed, in the peculiar accent of Scotland, "For this I thank thee, Lord! Let danger come as it will, thy servant is now prepared." End of chapter 14. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For further information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Last of the Mohicans by James Fenimore Cooper. Chapter 15. Then go we in to know his embassy, which I could with a ready guess declare, before the Frenchmen speak a word of it. King Henry V. A few succeeding days were passed amid the privations, the uproar, and the dangers of the siege, which was vigorously pressed by a power against whose approaches Munro possessed no competent means of resistance. It appeared as if Webb, with his army, which lay slumbering on the banks of the Hudson, had utterly forgotten the strait to which his countrymen were reduced. Montcalm had filled the woods of the portage with his savages, every yell and whoop from whom rang through the British encampment, chilling the hearts of men who were already but too much disposed to magnify the danger. Not so, however, with the besieged. Animated by the words and stimulated by the examples of their leaders, they had found their courage and maintained their ancient reputation with a zeal that did justice to the stern character of their commander. As if satisfied with the toil of marching through the wilderness to encounter his enemy, the French general, though of approved skill, had neglected to seize the adjacent mountains, whence the besieged might have been exterminated with impunity, and which, in the more modern warfare of the country, would not have been neglected for a single hour. This sort of contempt for eminences, or rather dread of the labour of ascending them, might have been termed the besetting weakness of the warfare of the period. It originated in the simplicity of the Indian contests, in which, from the nature of the combats and the density of the forests, fortresses were rare and artillery next to useless. The carelessness engendered by these usages descended even to the war of the Revolution, and lost the States the important fortress of Ticonderoga, opening a way for the army of Burgoyne into what was then the bosom of the country. We look back at this ignorance or infatuation, whichever it may be called, with wonder, knowing that the neglect of an eminence whose difficulties, like those of Mount Defiance, have been so greatly exaggerated, would at the present time prove fatal to the reputation of the engineer who had planned the works at their base, or to that of the general whose lot it was to defend them. The tourist, the valetudinarian, or the amateur of the beauties of nature, who, in the train of his four-in-hand, now rolls through the scenes we have attempted to describe in quest of information, health, or pleasure, or floats steadily towards his object on those artificial waters which have sprung up under the administration of a statesman, note evidently the late De Witt Clinton, who died governor of New York in 1828, under the administration of a statesman who has dared to stake his political character on the hazardous issue, is not to suppose that his ancestors traversed those hills or struggled with the same currents with equal facility. The transportation of a single heavy gun was often considered equal to a victory gained, if, happily, the difficulties of the passage had not so far separated it from its necessary concomitant, the ammunition, as to render it no more than a useless tube of unwieldy iron. The evils of this state of things pressed heavily on the fortunes of the resolute Scotsman who now defended William Henry. Though his adversary neglected the hills, he had planted his batteries with judgment on the plain, and caused them to be served with vigour and skill. Against this assault the besieged could only oppose the imperfect and hasty preparations of a fortress in the wilderness. It was in the afternoon of the 5th day of the siege, and the 4th of his own service in it, that Major Heyward profited by a parley that had just been beaten, by repairing to the ramparts of one of the water bastions to breathe the cool air from the lake, and to take a survey of the progress of the siege. He was alone, if the solitary sentinel who paced the mound be excepted, for the artillerists had hastened also to profit by the temporary suspension of their arduous duties. The evening was delightfully calm, and the light air from the limpid water fresh and soothing. It seemed as if, with the termination to the roar of artillery and the plunging of shot, nature had also seized the moment to assume her mildest and most captivating form. The sun poured down his parting glory on the scene without the oppression of those fierce rays that belong to the climate and the season. The mountains looked green and fresh and lovely, tempered with the milder light or softened in shadow, as thin vapours floated between them and the sun. The numerous islands rested on the bosom of the Horican, some low and sunken, as if embedded in the waters, and others appeared to hover above the element in little hillocks of green velvet, among which the fishermen of the beleaguering army peacefully rowed their skiffs, or floated at rest on the glassy mirror, in quiet pursuit of their employment. The scene was at once animated and still. All that pertained to nature was sweet or simply grand, while those parts which depended on the temper and movements of man were lively and playful. Two little spotless flags were abroad, the one on a salient angle of the fort, and the other on the advanced battery of the besiegers, emblems of the truce, which existed not only to the acts, but it would seem also to the enmity of the combatants. Behind these again swung, heavily opening and closing in silken folds, the rival standards of England and France. 100 gay and thoughtless young Frenchmen were drawing a net to the pebbly beach, within dangerous proximity to the sullen but silent cannon of the fort, while the eastern mountain was sending back the loud shouts and gay merriment that attended their sport. Some were rushing eagerly to enjoy the aquatic games of the lake, and others were already toiling their way up the neighbouring hills with the restless curiosity of their nation. To all these sports and pursuits, those of the enemy who watched the besieged and the besieged themselves were, however, merely the idle, though sympathizing, spectators. Here and there a picket had indeed raised a song or mingled in a dance, which had drawn the dusky savages around them from their lairs in the forest. In short, everything wore rather the appearance of a day of pleasure than of an hour stolen from the dangers and toil of a bloody and vindictive warfare. Duncan had stood in a musing attitude, contemplating this scene a few minutes, when his eyes were directed to the glacis in front of the sally-port already mentioned, by the sound of approaching footsteps. He walked to an angle of the bastion, and beheld the scout advancing, under the custody of a French officer, to the body of the fort. The countenance of Hawkeye was haggard and careworn, and his air dejected, as though he felt the deepest degradation at having fallen into the power of his enemies. He was without his favourite weapon, and his arms were even bound behind him with thongs made of the skin of a deer. The arrival of flags to cover the messengers of summons had occurred so often of late, that when Heyward first threw his careless glance on this group, he expected to see another of the officers of the enemy charged with a similar office. But the instant he recognised the tall person and still sturdy though downcast features of his friend the woodsman, he started with surprise, and turned to descend from the bastion into the bosom of the work. The sounds of other voices, however, caught his attention, and for a moment caused him to forget his purpose. At the inner angle of the mound he met the sisters walking along the parapet, in search, like himself, of air and relief from confinement. They had not met since that painful moment when he deserted them on the plain, only to assure their safety. He had parted from them worn with care and jaded with fatigue. He now saw them refreshed and blooming, though timid and anxious. Under such an inducement, it will cause no surprise that the young man lost sight for a time of other objects in order to address them. He was, however, anticipated by the voice of the ingenuous and youthful Alice. "Ah, thou truant, thou recreant knight, he who abandons his damsels in the very lists!" she cried. "Here we have been days, nay ages, expecting you at our feet, imploring mercy and forgetfulness of your craven backsliding, or I should rather say back running, for verily you fled in a manner that no stricken deer, as our worthy friend the scout would say, could equal." "You know that Alice means our thanks and our blessings," added the graver and more thoughtful Cora. "In truth, we have a little wondered why you should so rigidly absent yourself from a place where the gratitude of the daughters might receive the support of a parent's thanks. Your father himself could tell you that, though absent from your presence, I have not been altogether forgetful of your safety," returned the young man. "The mastery of yonder village of huts," pointing to the neighbouring entrenched camp, "has been keenly disputed, and he who holds it is sure to be possessed of this fort, and that which it contains. My days and my nights have all been passed there since we separated, because I thought that duty called me thither. But," he added with an air of chagrin, which he endeavoured, though unsuccessfully, to conceal, "had I been aware that what I then believed a soldier's conduct could be so construed, shame would have been added to the list of reasons." "Heyward! Duncan!" exclaimed Alice, bending forward to read his half averted countenance, until a lock of her golden hair rested on her flushed cheek, and nearly concealed the tear that had started to her eye. "Did I think this idle tongue of mine had pained you, I would silence it for ever. Cora can say, if Cora would, how justly we have prized your services, and how deep, I had almost said how fervent, is our gratitude." "And will Cora attest the truth of this?" cried Duncan, suffering the cloud to be chased from his countenance by a smile of open pleasure. "What says our graver sister? Would she find an excuse for the neglect of the night in the duty of a soldier?" Cora made no immediate answer, but turned her face towards the water, as if looking on the sheet of the Horican. When she did bend her dark eyes on the young man, They were yet filled with an expression of anguish that at once drove every thought but that of kind solicitude from his mind. "You are not well, dearest Miss Munro," he exclaimed. "We have trifled while you are in suffering." "'Tis nothing," she answered, refusing his offered support with feminine reserve. "That I cannot see the sunny side of the picture of life, like this artless but ardent enthusiast," she added, laying her hand lightly but affectionately on the arm of her sister, "is the penalty of experience, and, perhaps, the misfortune of my nature. See," she continued, as if determined to shake off infirmity in a sense of duty, "look around you, Major Heyward, and tell me what a prospect is this for the daughter of a soldier whose greatest happiness is his honour and his military renown." "Neither ought nor shall be tarnished by circumstances over which he has had no control," Duncan warmly replied. "But your words recall me to my own duty. I go now to your gallant father, to hear his determination in matters of the last moment to the defence. God bless you in every fortune, noble Cora, I may and must call you." She frankly gave him her hand, though her lip quivered, and her cheeks gradually became of an ashy paleness. "In every fortune I know you will be the ornament and honour to your sex. Alice, adieu." His tone changed from admiration to tenderness. "Adieu, Alice. We shall soon meet again, as conquerors, I trust, and amid rejoicings." Without waiting for an answer from either, the young man threw himself down the grassy steps of the bastion, and moving rapidly across the parade, he was quickly in the presence of their father. Munro was pacing his narrow apartment with a disturbed air and gigantic strides as Duncan entered. "You have anticipated my wishes, Major Heyward," he said. "I was about to request this favour." "I am sorry to see, sir, that the messenger I so warmly recommended has returned in custody of the French. I hope there is no reason to distrust his fidelity." "The fidelity of the Long Rifle is well known to me," returned Munro, "and is above suspicion, though his usual good fortune seems at last to have failed. Montcalm has got him, and with the accursed politeness of his nation, he has sent him in with a doleful tale of, knowing how I valued the fellow, he could not think of retaining him. A Jesuitical way that, Major Duncan Heyward, of telling a man of his misfortunes. But the general and his succour? Did ye look to the south as ye entered, and could ye not see them?" said the old soldier, laughing bitterly. "Hoot, hoot! You're an impatient boy, sir, and cannot give the gentlemen leisure for their march. They are coming, then? The scout has said as much? When, and by what path? For the dunce has omitted to tell me this. There is a letter, it would seem, too, and that is the only agreeable part of the matter. For the customary attentions of your Marquis of Montcalm, I warrant me, Duncan, that he of Lothian would buy a dozen such marquisates. But if the news of the letter were bad, the gentility of this French monsieur would certainly compel him to let us know it." "He keeps the letter, then, while he releases the messenger?" "Ay, that does he, and all for the sake of what you call your bonhomie. I would venture, if the truth was known, the fellow's grandfather taught the noble science of dancing. But what says the scout? He has eyes and ears and a tongue. What verbal report does he make?" "Oh, sir, he is not wanting in natural organs, and he is free to tell all that he has seen and heard. The whole amount is this: there is a fort of his Majesty's on the banks of the Hudson, called Edward, in honour of his gracious Highness of York, you'll know, and it is well filled with armed men, as such a work should be." "But was there no movement, no signs of any intention to advance to our relief?" "There were the morning and evening parades, and when one of the provincial loons, you'll know, Duncan, you're half a Scotsman yourself, when one of them dropped his powder over his porridge, if it touched the coals, it just burnt." Then suddenly changing his bitter, ironical manner to one more grave and thoughtful, he continued, "And yet there might and must be something in that letter which it would be well to know." "Our decision should be speedy," said Duncan, gladly availing himself of this change of humour to press the more important objects of their interview. "I cannot conceal from you, sir, that the camp will not be much longer tenable, and I am sorry to add that things appear no better in the fort. More than half the guns are bursted." "And how should it be otherwise? Some were fished from the bottom of the lake, Some have been rusting in the woods since the discovery of the country, and some were never guns at all, mere privateersmen's playthings. Do you think, sir, you can have Woolwich Warren in the midst of a wilderness, 3,000 miles from Great Britain? The walls are crumbling about our ears, and provisions beginning to fail us," continued Heyward, without regarding this new burst of indignation. "Even the men show signs of discontent and alarm." "Major Heyward," said Munro, turning to his youthful associate with the dignity of his years and superior rank, "I should have served his majesty for half a century, and earned these grey hairs in vain, were I ignorant of all you say, and of the pressing nature of our circumstances. Still, there is everything due to the honour of the king's arms, and something to ourselves. While there is hope of succour, this fortress will I defend, though it be to be done with pebbles gathered on the lake shore. It is a sight of the letter, therefore, that we want, that we may know the intentions of the man the Earl of Loudon has left among us as his substitute. And can I be of service in this matter?" "Sir, you can. The Marquis of Montcalm has, in addition to his other civilities, invited me to a personal interview between the works and his own camp, in order, as he says, to impart some additional information. Now I think it would not be wise to show any undue solicitude to meet him, and I would employ you, an officer of rank, as my substitute, for it would but ill comport with the honour of Scotland to let it be said one of her gentlemen was outdone in civility by a native of any other country on earth." Without assuming the supererogatory task of entering into a discussion of the comparative merits of national courtesy, Duncan cheerfully assented to supply the place of the veteran in the approaching interview. A long and confidential communication now succeeded, during which the young man received some additional insight into his duty from the experience and native acuteness of his commander, and then the former took his leave. As Duncan could only act as the representative of the commandant of the fort, the ceremonies which should have accompanied a meeting between the heads of the adverse forces were of course dispensed with. The truce still existed, and with a roll and beat of the drum, and covered by a little white flag, Duncan left the sally-port within 10 minutes after his instructions were ended. He was received by the French officer in advance with the usual formalities, and immediately accompanied to a distant marquee of the renowned soldier who led the forces of France. The general of the enemy received the youthful messenger surrounded by his principal officers, and by a swarthy band of the native chiefs who had followed him to the field, with the warriors of their several tribes. Heyward paused short when, in glancing his eyes rapidly over the dark group of the latter, he beheld the malignant countenance of Magua regarding him with the calm but sullen attention which marked the expression of that subtle savage. A slight exclamation of surprise even burst from the lips of the young man; but instantly recollecting his errand, and the presence in which he stood, he suppressed every appearance of emotion, and turned to the hostile leader, who had already advanced a step to receive him. The Marquis of Montcalm was, at the period of which we write, in the flower of his age, and, it may be added, in the zenith of his fortunes; but even in that enviable situation he was affable, and distinguished as much for his attention to the forms of courtesy as for that chivalrous courage which only 2 years afterwards induced him to throw away his life on the plains of Abraham. Duncan, in turning his eyes from the malign expression of Magua, suffered them to rest with pleasure on the smiling and polished features and the noble military air of the French general. "Monsieur," said the latter, "j'ai beaucoup de plaisir à... Bah! Où est cet interprète?" "Je crois, monsieur, qu'il ne sera pas nécessaire," Heyward modestly replied. "Je parle un peu de français." "Ah, j'en suis bien aise," said Montcalm, taking Duncan familiarly by the arm, and leading him deep into the marquee, a little out of earshot. "Je déteste ces frapons-là. On ne sait jamais sur quel pied on est avec eux. Eh bien, monsieur," he continued, still speaking in French, "though I should have been proud of receiving your commandant, I am very happy that he has seen proper to employ an officer so distinguished, and who, I am sure, is so amiable as yourself." Duncan bowed low, pleased with the compliment, in spite of a most heroic determination to suffer no artifice to allure him into forgetfulness of the interests of his prince, and Montcalm, after a pause of a moment, as if to collect his thoughts, proceeded: "Your commandant is a brave man, and well qualified to repel my assaults. Mais, monsieur, is it not time to begin to take more counsel of humanity and less of your courage? The one as strongly characterizes the hero as the other." "We consider the qualities as inseparable," returned Duncan, smiling; "but while we find in the vigor of your Excellency every motive to stimulate the one, we can, as yet, see no particular call for the exercise of the other." Montcalm, in his turn, slightly bowed, but it was with the air of a man too practised to remember the language of flattery. After musing a moment, he added: "It is possible my glasses have deceived me, and that your works resist our cannon better than I had supposed. You know our force." "Our accounts vary," said Duncan, carelessly. "The highest, however, has not exceeded 20,000 men." The Frenchman bit his lip, and fastened his eyes keenly on the other, as if to read his thoughts. Then, with a readiness peculiar to himself, he continued, as if assenting to the truth of an enumeration which quite doubled his army: "It is a poor compliment to the vigilance of us soldiers, monsieur, that, do what we will, we never can conceal our numbers. If it were to be done at all, one would believe it might succeed in these woods. Though you think it too soon to listen to the calls of humanity," he added, smiling archly, "I may be permitted to believe that gallantry is not forgotten by one so young as yourself." "The daughters of the commandant, I learn, have passed into the fort since it was invested?" "It is true, monsieur; but so far from weakening our efforts, they set us an example of courage in their own fortitude. Were nothing but resolution necessary to repel so accomplished a soldier as Monsieur de Montcalm, I would gladly trust the defence of William Henry to the elder of those ladies." "We have a wise ordinance in our Salic laws, which says, 'The crown of France shall never degrade the lance to the distaff,'" said Montcalm dryly, and with a little hauteur; but instantly adding, with his former frank and easy air, "As all the nobler qualities are hereditary, I can easily credit you; though, as I said before, courage has its limits, and humanity must not be forgotten. I trust, monsieur, you come authorized to treat for the surrender of the place?" "Has your excellency found our defence so feeble as to believe the measure necessary?" "I should be sorry to have the defence protracted in such a manner as to irritate my red friends there," continued Montcalm, glancing his eyes at the group of grave and attentive Indians, without attending to the other's question. "I find it difficult even now to limit them to the usages of war." Heyward was silent, for a painful recollection of the dangers he had so recently escaped came over his mind, and recalled the images of those defenseless beings who had shared in all his sufferings. "Ces messieurs là," said Montcalm, following up the advantage which he conceived he had gained, "are most formidable when baffled, and it is unnecessary to tell you with what difficulty they are restrained in their anger. Eh bien, monsieur, shall we speak of the terms? I fear your excellency has been deceived as to the strength of William Henry and the resources of its garrison." "I have not sat down before Quebec but an earthen work that is defended by 2300 gallant men," was the laconic reply. "Our mounds are earthen, certainly, nor are they seated on the rocks of Cape Diamond, but they stand on that shore which proved so destructive to Dieskau and his army. There is also a powerful force within a few hours' march of us, which we account upon as part of our means." "Some 6,000 or 8,000 men," returned Montcalm, with much apparent indifference, "whom their leader wisely judges to be safer in their works than in the field." It was now Heyward's turn to bite his lip with vexation, as the other so coolly alluded to a force which the young man knew to be overrated. Both mused a little while in silence, when Montcalm renewed the conversation in a way that showed he believed the visit of his guest was solely to propose terms of capitulation. On the other hand, Heyward began to throw sundry inducements in the way of the French general to betray the discoveries he had made through the intercepted letter. The artifice of neither, however, succeeded; and after a protracted and fruitless interview, Duncan took his leave, favourably impressed with an opinion of the courtesy and talents of the enemy's captain, but as ignorant of what he came to learn as when he arrived. Montcalm followed him as far as the entrance of the marquee, renewing his invitations to the commander of the fort to give him an immediate meeting in the open ground between the two armies. There they separated, and Duncan returned to the advanced post of the French, accompanied as before, whence he instantly proceeded to the fort and to the quarters of his own commander. End of chapter 15. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For further information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Last of the Mohicans by James Fenimore Cooper. Chapter 16. Edgar, before you fight the battle, ope this letter. King Lear. Major Heyward found Munro attended only by his daughters. Alice sat upon his knee, parting the grey hairs on the forehead of the old man with her delicate fingers, and whenever he affected to frown on her trifling, appeasing his assumed anger by pressing her ruby lips fondly on his wrinkled brow. Cora was seated nigh them, a calm and amused looker-on, regarding the wayward movements of her more youthful sister with that species of maternal fondness which characterized her love for Alice. Not only the dangers through which they had passed, but those which still impended above them, appeared to be momentarily forgotten in the soothing indulgence of such a family meeting. It seemed as if they had profited by the short truce to devote an instant to the purest and best affections, the daughters forgetting their fears, and the veteran his cares, in the security of the moment. Of this scene Duncan, who in his eagerness to report his arrival had entered unannounced, stood many moments an unobserved and delighted spectator. But the quick and dancing eyes of Alice soon caught a glimpse of his figure reflected from a glass, and she sprang blushing from her father's knee, exclaiming aloud, "Major Heyward!" "What of the lad?" demanded her father. "I have sent him to crack a little with the Frenchmen. Ha, sir, you are young, and you're nimble. Away with you, ye baggage, as if there were not troubles enough for a soldier, without having his camp filled with such prattling hussies as yourself." Alice laughingly followed her sister, who instantly led the way from an apartment where she perceived their presence was no longer desirable. Munro, instead of demanding the result of the young man's mission, paced the room for a few moments, with his hands behind his back, and his head inclined towards the floor, like a man lost in thought. At length he raised his eyes, glistening with a father's fondness, and exclaimed, "They are a pair of excellent girls, Heyward, and such as any one may boast of." "You are not now to learn my opinion of your daughters, Colonel Munro." "True, lad, true," interrupted the impatient old man. "You were about opening your mind more fully on that matter the day you got in. But I do not think it becoming in an old soldier to be talking of nuptial blessings and wedding jokes, when the enemies of his king were likely to be unbidden guests at the feast. But I was wrong, Duncan, boy, I was wrong there, and I am now ready to hear what you have to say." "Notwithstanding the pleasure your assurance gives me, dear sir, I have just now a message from Montcalm." "Let the Frenchman and all his host go to the devil, sir!" exclaimed the hasty veteran. "He is not yet master of William Henry, nor shall he ever be, provided Webb proves himself the man he should. No, sir, thank heaven, we are not yet in such a strait that it can be said Munro is too much pressed to discharge the little domestic duties of his own family. Your mother was the only child of my bosom friend, Duncan, and I'll just give you a hearing, though all the knights of St. Louis were in a body at the sally-port, with the French saint at their head, craving to speak a word under favour. A pretty degree of knighthood, sir, is that which can be bought with sugar hogsheads, and then your twopenny marquisates. The thistle is the order for dignity and antiquity, the veritable nemo me impune lacessit of chivalry. Ye had ancestors in that degree, Duncan, and they were an ornament to the nobles of Scotland. Heyward, who perceived that his superior took a malicious pleasure in exhibiting his contempt for the message of the French general, was fain to humour a spleen that he knew would be short-lived. He therefore replied, with as much indifference as he could assume on such a subject. My request, as you know, sir, went so far as to presume to the honour of being your son. Ay, boy, you found words to make yourself very plainly comprehended. But let me ask ye, sir, have you been as intelligible to the girl? On my honour, no, exclaimed Duncan warmly. There would have been an abuse of a confided trust had I taken advantage of my situation for such a purpose. Your notions are those of a gentleman, Major Heyward, and well enough in their place. But Cora Munro is a maiden too discreet, and of a mind too elevated and improved, to need the guardianship even of a father. Cora? Ay, Cora? We are talking of your pretensions to Miss Munro, are we not? I was not conscious of having mentioned her name, said Duncan, stammering. And to marry whom, then, did you wish my consent, Major Heyward? Demanded the old soldier, erecting himself in the dignity of offended feeling. You have another and not less lovely child. Alice! exclaimed the father, in an astonishment equal to that with which Duncan had just repeated the name of her sister. Such was the direction of my wishes, sir. The young man awaited in silence the result of the extraordinary effect produced by a communication which, as it now appeared, was so unexpected. For several minutes Munro paced the chamber with long and rapid strides, his rigid features working convulsively, and every faculty seemingly absorbed in the musings of his own mind. At length he paused directly in front of Heyward, and riveting his eyes upon those of the other, he said, with a lip that quivered violently, Duncan Heyward, I have loved you for the sake of him whose blood is in your veins. I have loved you for your own good qualities, and I have loved you because I thought you would contribute to the happiness of my child. But all this love would turn to hatred, were I assured that what I so much apprehend is true. God forbid that any act or thought of mine should lead to such a change, exclaimed the young man, whose eye never quailed under the penetrating look it encountered. Without adverting to the impossibility of the other's comprehending those feelings which were hid in his own bosom, Munro suffered himself to be appeased by the unaltered countenance he met, and with a voice sensibly softened, he continued, You would be my son, Duncan, and you're ignorant of the history of the man you wish to call your father. Sit ye down, young man, and I will open to you the wounds of a sacred heart in as few words as may be suitable. By this time the message of Montcalm was as much forgotten by him who bore it as by the man for whose ears it was intended. Each drew a chair, and while the veteran communed a few moments with his own thoughts, apparently in sadness, the youth suppressed his impatience in a look and attitude of respectful attention. At length the former spoke. "You'll know already, Major Heyward, that my family was both ancient and honourable," commenced the Scotsman, "though it might not altogether be endowed with that amount of wealth that should correspond with its degree. I was, may be, such a one as yourself, when I plighted my faith to Alice Graham, the only child of a neighbouring laird of some estate. But the connection was disagreeable to her father, on more accounts than my poverty. I did, therefore, what an honest man should, restored the maiden her troth, and departed the country in the service of my king. I had seen many regions, and had shed much blood in different lands, before duty called me to the islands of the West Indies. There it was my lot to form a connection with one who in time became my wife and the mother of Cora. She was the daughter of a gentleman of those isles, by a lady whose misfortune it was, if you will," said the old man proudly, "to be descended remotely from that unfortunate class who are so basely enslaved to administer to the wants of a luxurious people. Ay, sir, that is a curse entailed on Scotland by her unnatural union with a foreign and trading people." But could I find a man among them who would dare to reflect on my child, he should feel the weight of a father's anger. Ha! Major Heyward, you are yourself born at the South, where these unfortunate beings are considered of a race inferior to your own." "'Tis most unfortunately true, sir," said Duncan, unable any longer to prevent his eyes from sinking to the floor in embarrassment. "And you cast it on my child as a reproach? You scorn to mingle the blood of the Heywards with one so degraded, lovely and virtuous though she be?" fiercely demanded the jealous parent. "Heaven protect me from a prejudice so unworthy of my reason," returned Duncan, at the same time conscious of such a feeling, and that as deeply rooted as if it had been engrafted in his nature. "The sweetness, the beauty, the witchery of your younger daughter, Colonel Munro, might explain my motives, without imputing to me this injustice." "Ye are right, sir," returned the old man, again changing his tones to those of gentleness, or rather softness. "The girl is the image of what her mother was at her years, and before she had become acquainted with grief. When death deprived me of my wife, I returned to Scotland, enriched by the marriage; and would you think it, Duncan, the suffering angel had remained in the heartless state of celibacy 20 long years, and that for the sake of a man who could forget her. She did more, sir. She overlooked my want of faith, and all difficulties being now removed, she took me for her husband." "And became the mother of Alice?" exclaimed Duncan, with an eagerness that might have proved dangerous at a moment when the thoughts of Munro were less occupied than at present. "She did indeed," said the old man, "and dearly did she pay for the blessing she bestowed. But she is a saint in heaven, sir, and it ill becomes one whose foot rests on the grave to mourn a lot so blessed. I had her but a single year, though, a short term of happiness for one who had seen her youth fade in hopeless pining." There was something so commanding in the distress of the old man, that Heyward did not dare to venture a syllable of consolation. Munro sat utterly unconscious of the other's presence, his features exposed and working with the anguish of his regrets, while the heavy tears fell from his eyes and rolled unheeded from his cheeks to the floor. At length he moved, as if suddenly recovering his recollection, when he arose, and taking a single turn across the room, he approached his companion with an air of military grandeur, and demanded, "Have you not, Major Heyward, some communication that I should hear from the Marquis de Montcalm?" Duncan started in his turn, and immediately commenced, in an embarrassed voice, the half forgotten message. It is unnecessary to dwell upon the evasive, though polite manner with which the French general had eluded every attempt of Heyward to worm from him the purport of the communication he had proposed making, or on the decided, though still polished, message by which he now gave his enemy to understand that unless he chose to receive it in person, he should not receive it at all. As Munro listened to the detail of Duncan, the excited feelings of the father gradually gave way before the obligations of his station, and when the other was done, he saw before him nothing but the veteran, swelling with the wounded feelings of a soldier. "You have said enough, Major Heyward," exclaimed the angry old man, "enough to make a volume of commentary on French civility. Here has this gentleman invited me to a conference, and when I send him a capable substitute, for you're all that, Duncan, though your years are but few, he answers me with a riddle. He may have thought less favourably of the substitute, my dear sir, and you will remember that the invitation which he now repeats was to the commandant of the works, and not to his second." "Well, sir, is not a substitute clothed with all the power and dignity of him who grants the commission?" "He wishes to confer with Munro. Faith, sir, I have much inclination to indulge the man, if it should only be to let him behold the firm countenance we maintain, in spite of his numbers and his summons." "There might be no bad policy in such a stroke, young man." Duncan, who believed it of the last importance that they should speedily come at the contents of the letter borne by the scout, gladly encouraged this idea. "Without doubt he could gather no confidence by witnessing our indifference," he said. You never said a truer word. I could wish, sir, that he would visit the works in open day and in the form of a storming party. That is the least failing method of proving the countenance of an enemy, and would be far preferable to the battering system he has chosen. The beauty and manliness of warfare has been much deformed, Major Heyward, by the arts of your Monsieur Vauban. Our ancestors were far above such scientific cowardice. It may be very true, sir, but we are now obliged to repel art by art. What is your pleasure in the matter of the interview? I will meet the Frenchman, and that without fear or delay. Promptly, sir, as becomes the servant of my royal master. Go, Major Heyward, and give them a flourish of the music, and send out a messenger to let them know who is coming. We will follow with a small guard, for such respect is due to one who holds the honour of his king in keeping. And harkye, Duncan, he added in a half whisper, though they were alone, it may be prudent to have some aid at hand, in case there should be treachery at the bottom of it all. The young man availed himself of this order to quit the apartment, and as the day was fast coming to a close, he hastened without delay to make the necessary arrangements. A very few minutes only were necessary to parade a few files, and to dispatch an orderly with a flag to announce the approach of the commandant of the fort. When Duncan had done both these, he led the guard to the sally-port, near which he found his superior ready, waiting for his appearance. As soon as the usual ceremonials of a military departure were observed, the veteran and his more youthful companion left the fortress attended by the escort. They had proceeded only 100 yards from the works, when the little array which attended the French general to the conference was seen issuing from the hollow way which formed the bed of a brook that ran between the batteries of the besiegers and the fort. From the moment that Munro left his own works to appear in front of his enemies, his air had been grand, and his step and countenance highly military. The instant he caught a glimpse of the white plume that waved in the hat of Montcalm, his eye lighted, and age no longer appeared to possess any influence over his vast and still muscular person. "Speak to the boys to be watchful, sir," he said in an undertone to Duncan, "and to look well to their flints and steel, for one is never safe with a servant of these Louis. At the same time we will show them the front of men in deep security. You'll understand me, Major Heyward." He was interrupted by the clamour of a drum from the approaching Frenchmen, which was immediately answered, when each party pushed an orderly in advance, bearing a white flag, and the wary Scotsman halted, with his guard close at his back. As soon as this slight salutation had passed, Montcalm moved towards them with a quick but graceful step, baring his head to the veteran, and dropping his spotless plume nearly to the earth in courtesy. If the air of Munro was more commanding and manly, it wanted both the ease and insinuating polish of that of the Frenchman. Neither spoke for a few moments, each regarding the other with curious and interested eyes. Then, as became his superior rank and the nature of the interview, Montcalm broke the silence. After uttering the usual words of greeting, he turned to Duncan, and continued with a smile of recognition, speaking always in French. "I am rejoiced, monsieur, that you have given us the pleasure of your company on this occasion. There will be no necessity to employ an ordinary interpreter, for in your hands I feel the same security as if I spoke your language myself." Duncan acknowledged the compliment, when Montcalm, turning to his guard, which, in imitation of that of their enemies, placed close upon him, continued, "En arrière, mes enfants, il fait chaud. Retirez-vous un peu." Before Major Heyward would imitate this proof of confidence, he glanced his eyes around the plain, and beheld with uneasiness the numerous dusky groups of savages who looked out from the margin of the surrounding woods, curious spectators of the interview. "Monsieur de Montcalm will readily acknowledge the difference in our situation," he said, with some embarrassment, pointing at the same time towards those dangerous foes who were to be seen in almost every direction. "Were we to dismiss our guard, we should stand here at the mercy of our enemies." "Monsieur, you have the plighted faith of un gentilhomme français," for your safety," returned Montcalm, laying his hand impressively on his heart. "It should suffice." "It shall. Fall back," Duncan added to the officer who led the escort. "Fall back, sir, beyond hearing, and wait for orders." Munro witnessed this movement with manifest uneasiness, nor did he fail to demand an instant explanation. "Is it not our interest, sir, to betray no distrust?" retorted Duncan. "Monsieur de Montcalm pledges his word for our safety, and I have ordered the men to withdraw a little, in order to prove how much we depend on his assurance." "It may be all right, sir, but I have no overweening reliance on the faith of these marquises, or marquis, as they call themselves. Their patents of nobility are too common to be certain that they bear the seal of true honour." "You forget, dear sir, that we confer with an officer distinguished alike in Europe and America for his deeds. From a soldier of his reputation we can have nothing to apprehend." The old man made a gesture of resignation, though his rigid features still betrayed his obstinate adherence to a distrust which he derived from a sort of hereditary contempt of his enemy, rather than from any present signs which might warrant so uncharitable a feeling. Montcalm waited patiently until this little dialogue in demi-voice was ended, when he drew nigher and opened the subject of their conference. "I have solicited this interview from your superior, monsieur," he said, "because I believe he will allow himself to be persuaded that he has already done everything which is necessary for the honour of his prince, and will now listen to the admonitions of humanity. I will for ever bear testimony that his resistance has been gallant, and was continued as long as there was hope." When this opening was translated to Munro, he answered, with dignity, but with sufficient courtesy, "However I may prize such testimony from Monsieur Montcalm, it will be more valuable when it shall be better merited." The French general smiled as Duncan gave him the purport of this reply, and observed, "What is now so freely accorded to approved courage may be refused to useless obstinacy. Monsieur would wish to see my camp, and witness for himself our numbers, and the impossibility of his resisting them with success." "I know that the King of France is well served," returned the unmoved Scotsman, as soon as Duncan ended his translation; "but my own royal master has as many, and as faithful, troops." "Though not at hand, fortunately for us," said Montcalm, without waiting, in his ardour, for the interpreter. "There is a destiny in war to which a brave man knows how to submit with the same courage that he faces his foes." "Had I been conscious that Monsieur Montcalm was master of the English, I should have spared myself the trouble of so awkward a translation," said the vexed Duncan dryly, remembering instantly his recent by-play with Munro. "Your pardon, monsieur," rejoined the Frenchman, suffering a slight colour to appear on his dark cheek. "There is a vast difference between understanding and speaking a foreign tongue. You will, therefore, please to assist me still." Then, after a short pause, he added, "These hills afford us every opportunity of reconnoitring your works, messieurs, and I am possibly as well acquainted with their weak condition as you can be yourselves." "Ask the French general if his glasses can reach to the Hudson," said Munro proudly, "and if he knows when and where to expect the army of Webb." "Let General Webb be his own interpreter," returned the politic Montcalm, suddenly extending an open letter towards Munro as he spoke. "You will there learn, monsieur, that his movements are not likely to prove embarrassing to my army." The veteran seized the offered paper without waiting for Duncan to translate the speech, and with an eagerness that betrayed how important he deemed its contents. As his eye passed hastily over the words, his countenance changed from its look of military pride to one of deep chagrin. His lip began to quiver, and suffering the paper to fall from his hand, his head dropped upon his chest, like that of a man whose hopes were withered at a single blow. Duncan caught the letter from the ground, and without apology for the liberty he took, he read at a glance its cruel purport. Their common superior, so far from encouraging them to resist, advised a speedy surrender, urging in the plainest language, as a reason, the utter impossibility of his sending a single man to their rescue. "Here is no deception," exclaimed Duncan, examining the billet both inside and out. "This is the signature of Webb, and must be the captured letter." "The man has betrayed me!" Munro at length bitterly exclaimed. "He has brought dishonour to the door of one where disgrace was never before known to dwell, and shame has he heaped heavily on my grey hairs." "Say not so," cried Duncan. "We are yet masters of the fort, and of our honour. Let us then sell our lives at such a rate as shall make our enemies believe the purchase too dear." "Boy, I thank thee!" exclaimed the old man, rousing himself from his stupor. "You have for once reminded Munro of his duty. We will go back and dig our graves behind these ramparts." "Messieurs," said Montcalm, advancing towards them a step in generous interest, "you little know Louis de Saint Véran, if you believe him capable of profiting by this letter to humble brave men, or to build up a dishonest reputation for himself. Listen to my terms before you leave me." "What says the Frenchman?" demanded the veteran sternly. "Does he make a merit of having captured a scout with a note from headquarters? Sir, he had better raise the siege, to go and sit down before Edward, if he wishes to frighten his enemy with words." Duncan explained the other's meaning. "Monsieur de Montcalm, we will hear you," the veteran added, more calmly, as Duncan ended. "To retain the fort is now impossible," said his liberal enemy. "It is necessary to the interests of my master that it should be destroyed. But as for yourselves and your brave comrades, there is no privilege dear to a soldier that shall be denied." "Our colours?" demanded Heyward. "Carry them to England, and show them to your king. Our arms? Keep them; none can use them better. Our march? The surrender of the place? Shall all be done in a way most honourable to yourselves." Duncan now turned to explain these proposals to his commander, who heard him with amazement, and a sensibility that was deeply touched by so unusual and unexpected generosity. "Go you, Duncan," he said. "Go with this marquis, as indeed marquis he should be. Go to his marquee, and arrange it all. I have lived to see two things in my old age that never did I expect to behold: an Englishman afraid to support a friend, and a Frenchman too honest to profit by his advantage." So saying, the veteran again dropped his head to his chest, and returned slowly towards the fort, exhibiting, by the dejection of his air, to the anxious garrison a harbinger of evil tidings. From the shock of this unexpected blow the haughty feelings of Munro never recovered; but from that moment there commenced a change in his determined character which accompanied him to a speedy grave. Duncan remained to settle the terms of the capitulation. He was seen to re-enter the works during the first watches of the night, and immediately after a private conference with the commandant, to leave them again. It was then openly announced that hostilities must cease, Munro having signed a treaty by which the place was to be yielded to the enemy with the morning; the garrison to retain their arms, their colours, and their baggage, and consequently, according to military opinion, their honour. End of chapter 16. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For further information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Last of the Mohicans by James Fenimore Cooper. Chapter 17. Weave we the woof, the thread is spun, the web is wove, the work is done. Gray. The hostile armies which lay in the wilds of the Horican passed the night of the 9th of August, 1757, much in the manner they would, had they encountered on the fairest field of Europe. While the conquered were still, sullen, and dejected, the victors triumphed. But there are limits alike to grief and joy, and long before the watches of the morning came, the stillness of those boundless woods was only broken by a gay call from some exulting young Frenchmen of the advanced pickets, or a menacing challenge from the fort, which sternly forbade the approach of any hostile footsteps before the stipulated moment. Even these occasional threatening sounds ceased to be heard in that dull hour which precedes the day, at which period a listener might have sought in vain any evidence of the presence of those armed powers that then slumbered on the shores of the Holy Lake. It was during these moments of deep silence that the canvas which concealed the entrance to a spacious marquee in the French encampment was shoved aside, and a man issued from beneath the drapery into the open air. He was enveloped in a cloak which might have been intended as a protection from the chilling damps of the woods, but which served equally well as a mantle to conceal his person. He was permitted to pass the grenadier who watched over the slumbers of the French commander, without interruption, the man making the usual salute which betokens military deference, as the other passed swiftly through the little city of tents in the direction of William Henry. Whenever this unknown individual encountered one of the numberless sentinels who crossed his path, his answer was prompt, and, as it appeared, satisfactory, for he was uniformly allowed to proceed without further interrogation. With the exception of such repeated but brief interruptions, he had moved silently from the centre of the camp to its most advanced outposts, when he drew nigh the soldier who held his watch nearest to the works of the enemy. As he approached, he was received with the usual challenge. Qui vive? France, was the reply. Le mot d'ordre? La victoire, said the other, drawing so nigh as to be heard in a loud whisper. C'est bien, returned the sentinel, throwing his musket from the charge to his shoulder. Vous vous promenez bien matin, monsieur. Il est nécessaire d'être vigilant, mon enfant, the other observed, dropping a fold of his cloak, and looking the soldier close in the face as he passed him, still continuing his way towards the British fortification. The man started, his arms rattled heavily as he threw them forward in the lowest and most respectful salute, and when he had again recovered his peace, he turned to walk his post, muttering between his teeth, Il faut être vigilant en vérité. Je crois que nous avons là un caporal qui ne dort jamais. The officer proceeded, without affecting to hear the words which escaped the sentinel in his surprise, nor did he again pause until he had reached the low strand, and in a somewhat dangerous vicinity to the western water bastion of the fort. The light of an obscured moon was just sufficient to render objects, though dim, perceptible in their outlines. He therefore took the precaution to place himself against the trunk of a tree, where he leant for many minutes, and seemed to contemplate the dark and silent mounds of the English works in profound attention. His gaze at the ramparts was not that of a curious or idle spectator, but his looks wandered from point to point, denoting his knowledge of military usages, and betraying that his search was not unaccompanied by distrust. At length he appeared satisfied, and having cast his eyes impatiently upward towards the summit of the eastern mountain, as if anticipating the approach of the morning, he was in the act of turning on his footsteps, when a light sound on the nearest angle of the bastion caught his ear and induced him to remain. Just then a figure was seen to approach the edge of the rampart, where it stood, apparently contemplating in its turn the distant tents of the French encampment. Its head was then turned towards the east, as though equally anxious for the appearance of light, when the form leant against the mound, and seemed to gaze upon the glassy expanse of the waters, which, like a submarine firmament, glittered with its thousand mimic stars. The melancholy air, the hour, together with the vast frame of the man who thus leant, in musing, against the English ramparts, left no doubt as to his person in the mind of the observant spectator. Delicacy, no less than prudence, now urged him to retire, and he had moved cautiously round the body of the tree for that purpose, when another sound drew his attention, and once more arrested his footsteps. It was a low and almost inaudible movement of the water, and was succeeded by a grating of pebbles one against the other. In a moment he saw a dark form rise as it were out of the lake, and steal, without further noise, to the land, within a few feet of the place where he himself stood. A rifle next slowly rose between his eyes and the watery mirror, but before it could be discharged his own hand was on the lock. "Ah!" exclaimed the savage, whose treacherous aim was so singularly and so unexpectedly interrupted. Without making any reply, the French officer laid his hand on the shoulder of the Indian, and led him in profound silence to a distance from the spot where their subsequent dialogue might have proved dangerous, and where it seemed that one of them at least sought a victim. Then, throwing open his cloak, so as to expose his uniform and the cross of St. Louis, which was suspended at his breast, Montcalm sternly demanded, "What means this? Does not my son know that the hatchet is buried between the English and his Canadian father?" "What can the Hurons do?" returned the savage, speaking also, though imperfectly, in the French language. "Not a warrior has a scalp, and the palefaces make friends. Ah, le renard subtil! Methinks this is an excess of zeal for a friend who was so late an enemy. How many suns have set since Le Renard struck the war-post of the English?" "Where is that sun?" demanded the sullen savage. "Behind the hill, and it is dark and cold. But when he comes again, it will be bright and warm. Le Subtil is the son of his tribe. There have been clouds and many mountains between him and his nation, but now he shines, and it is a clear sky." "That Le Renard has power with his people I well know," said Montcalm, "for yesterday he hunted for their scalps, and today they hear him at the council fire. Magua is a great chief. Let him prove it by teaching his nation how to conduct towards our new friends." "Why did the chief of the Canadas bring his young men into the woods and fire his cannon at the earthen house?" demanded the subtle Indian. "To subdue it. My master owns the land, and your father was ordered to drive off these English squatters. They have consented to go, and now he calls them enemies no longer. 'Tis well. Magua took the hatchet to color it with blood. It is now bright. When it is red, it shall be buried. But Magua is pledged not to sully the lilies of France. The enemies of the great king across the salt lake are his enemies, his friends, the friends of the Hurons." "Friends!" repeated the Indian in scorn. "Let his father give Magua a hand." Montcalm, who felt that his influence over the warlike tribes he had gathered was to be maintained by concession rather than by power, complied reluctantly with the other's request. The savage placed the finger of the French commander on a deep scar in his bosom, and then exultingly demanded, "Does my father know that? What warrior does not? 'Tis where a leaden bullet has cut. And this," continued the Indian, who had turned his naked back to the other, his body being without its usual calico mantle. "This? My son has been sadly injured here. Who has done this?" "Magua slept hard in the English wigwams, and the sticks have left their mark," returned the savage, with a hollow laugh, which did not conceal the fierce temper that nearly choked him. Then, recollecting himself, with sudden and native dignity, he added, "Go, teach your young men it is peace. Le Renard Subtil knows how to speak to a Huron warrior." Without deigning to bestow further words, or to wait for any answer, the savage cast his rifle into the hollow of his arm, and moved silently through the encampment towards the woods, where his own tribe was known to lie. Every few yards, as he proceeded, he was challenged by the sentinels, but he stalked sullenly onward, utterly disregarding the summons of the soldiers, who only spared his life because they knew the air and tread no less than the obstinate daring of an Indian. Montcalm lingered long and melancholy on the strand, where he had been left by his companion, brooding deeply on the temper which his ungovernable ally had just discovered. Already had his fair fame been tarnished by one horrid scene, and in circumstances fearfully resembling those under which he now found himself. As he mused, he became keenly sensible of the deep responsibility they assume who disregard the means to attain their end, and of all the danger of setting in motion an engine which it exceeds human power to control. Then, shaking off a train of reflections that he accounted a weakness in such a moment of triumph, he retraced his steps towards his tent, giving the order, as he passed, to make the signal that should arouse the army from its slumbers. The first tap of the French drums was echoed from the bosom of the fort, and presently the valley was filled with the strains of martial music, rising long, thrilling, and lively above the rattling accompaniment. The horns of the victors sounded merry and cheerful flourishes, until the last laggard of the camp was at his post, but the instant the British fifes had blown their shrill signal, they became mute. In the meantime the day had dawned, and when the line of the French army was ready to receive its general, the rays of a brilliant sun were glancing along the glittering array. Then that success, which was already so well known, was officially announced. The favored band who were selected to guard the gates of the fort were detailed, and defiled before their chief. The signal of their approach was given, and all the usual preparations for a change of masters were ordered and executed directly under the guns of the contested works. A very different scene presented itself within the lines of the Anglo-American army. As soon as the warning signal was given, it exhibited all the signs of a hurried and forced departure. The sullen soldiers shouldered their empty tubes, and fell into their places like men whose blood had been heated by the past contest, and who only desired the opportunity to revenge an indignity which was still wounding to their pride, concealed as it was under all the observances of military etiquette. Women and children ran from place to place, some bearing the scanty remnants of their baggage, and others searching in the ranks for those countenances they looked up to for protection. Munro appeared among his silent troops, firm but dejected. It was evident that the unexpected blow had struck deep into his heart, though he struggled to sustain his misfortune with the port of a man. Duncan was touched at the quiet and impressive exhibition of his grief. He had discharged his own duty, and he now pressed to the side of the old man to know in what particular he might serve him. "My daughters," was the brief but expressive reply. "Good heavens, are not arrangements already made for their convenience?" "Today I am only a soldier, Major Heyward," said the veteran. "All that you see here claim alike to be my children." Duncan had heard enough. Without losing one of those moments which had now become so precious, he flew towards the quarters of Munro in quest of the sisters. He found them on the threshold of the low edifice, already prepared to depart, and surrounded by a clamorous and weeping assemblage of their own sex, that had gathered about the place with a sort of instinctive consciousness that it was the point most likely to be protected. Though the cheeks of Cora were pale, and her countenance anxious, she had lost none of her firmness; but the eyes of Alice were inflamed, and betrayed how long and bitterly she had wept. They both, however, received the young man with undisguised pleasure, the former, for a novelty, being the first to speak. "The fort is lost," she said, with a melancholy smile, "though our good name, I trust, remains. 'Tis brighter than ever. But, dearest Miss Munro, it is time to think less of others, and to make some provision for yourself. Military usage, pride, that pride on which you so much value yourself, demands that your father and I should, for a little while, continue with the troops. Then where to seek a proper protector for you against the confusion and chances of such a scene?" "None is necessary," returned Cora. "Who will dare to injure or insult the daughter of such a father at a time like this?" "I would not leave you alone," continued the youth, looking about him in a hurried manner, "for the command of the best regiment in the pay of the king. Remember, our Alice is not gifted with all your firmness, and God only knows the terror she might endure." "You may be right," Cora replied, smiling again, but far more sadly than before. "Listen! Chance has already sent us a friend when he is most needed." Duncan did listen, and on the instant comprehended her meaning. The low and serious sounds of the sacred music so well known to the eastern provinces, caught his ear, and instantly drew him to an apartment in an adjacent building which had already been deserted by its customary tenants. There he found David pouring out his pious feelings through the only medium in which he ever indulged. Duncan waited until, by the cessation of the movement of the hand, he believed the strain was ended, when, by touching his shoulder, he drew the attention of the other to himself, and in a few words explained his wishes. "Even so," replied the single-minded disciple of the King of Israel, when the young man had ended, "I have found much that is comely and melodious in the maidens, and it is fitting that we, who have consorted in so much peril, should abide together in peace. I will attend them when I have completed my morning praise, to which nothing is now wanting but the doxology. Wilt thou bear a part, friend? The metre is common, and the tune Southwell." Then, extending the little volume, and giving the pitch of the air anew with considerate attention, David recommenced and finished his strains, with a fixedness of manner that it was not easy to interrupt. Heyward was fain to wait until the verse was ended, when, seeing David relieving himself from his spectacles, and replacing the book, he continued, "It will be your duty to see that none dare to approach the ladies with any rude intention, or to offer insult or taunt at the misfortune of their brave father. In this task you will be seconded by the domestics of their household." "Even so." "It is possible that the Indians and stragglers of the enemy may intrude, in which case you will remind them of the terms of the capitulation, and threaten to report their conduct to Montcalm. A word will suffice." "If not, I have that here which shall," returned David, exhibiting his book, with an air in which meekness and confidence were singularly blended. "Here are words which, uttered, or rather thundered, with proper emphasis and in measured time, shall quiet the most unruly temper. Why rage the heathen furiously?" "Enough," said Heyward, interrupting the burst of his musical invocation. "We understand each other. It is time that we should now assume our respective duties." Gamut cheerfully assented, and together they sought the females. Cora received her new and somewhat extraordinary protector courteously at least, and the pallid features of Alice lighted again with some of their native archness as she thanked Heyward for his care. Duncan took occasion to assure them he had done the best that circumstances permitted, and, as he believed, quite enough for the security of their feelings. Of danger there was none. He then spoke gladly of his intention to rejoin them the moment he had led the advance a few miles towards the Hudson, and immediately took his leave. By this time the signal of departure had been given, and the head of the English column was in motion. The sisters started at the sound, and glancing their eyes around, they saw the white uniforms of the French grenadiers, who had already taken possession of the gates of the fort. At that moment an enormous cloud seemed to pass suddenly above their heads, and looking upwards, they discovered that they stood beneath the wide folds of the standard of France. "Let us go," said Cora. "This is no longer a fit place for the children of an English officer." Alice clung to the arm of her sister, and together they left the parade, accompanied by the moving throng that surrounded them. As they passed the gates, the French officers, who had learnt their rank, bowed often and low, forbearing, however, to intrude those attentions which they saw, with peculiar tact, might not be agreeable. As every vehicle and each beast of burden was occupied by the sick and wounded, Cora had decided to endure the fatigues of a foot march rather than interfere with their comforts. Indeed, many a maimed and feeble soldier was compelled to drag his exhausted limbs in the rear of the columns, for the want of the necessary means of conveyance in that wilderness. The whole, however, was in motion, the weak and wounded groaning and in suffering, their comrades silent and sullen, and the women and children in terror, they knew not of what. As the confused and timid throng left the protecting mounds of the fort, and issued on the open plain, the whole scene was at once presented to their eyes. At a little distance on the right, and somewhat in the rear, the French army stood to their arms, Montcalm having collected his parties so soon as his guards had possession of the works. They were attentive but silent observers of the proceedings of the vanquished, failing in none of the stipulated military honours, and offering no taunt or insult in their success to their less fortunate foes. Living masses of the English, to the amount in the whole of near 3,000, were moving slowly across the plain towards the common centre, and gradually approached each other as they converged to the point of their march, a vista cut through the lofty trees where the road to the Hudson entered the forest. Along the sweeping borders of the woods hung a dark cloud of savages, eyeing the passage of their enemies, and hovering at a distance like vultures who were only kept from stooping on their prey by the presence and restraint of a superior army. A few had straggled among the conquered columns, where they stalked in sullen discontent, attentive, though as yet passive, observers of the moving multitude. The advance, with Heyward at its head, had already reached the defile, and was slowly disappearing, when the attention of Cora was drawn to a collection of stragglers by the sounds of contention. A truant provincial was paying the forfeit of his disobedience by being plundered of those very effects which had caused him to desert his place in the ranks. The man was of powerful frame, and too avaricious to part with his goods without a struggle. Individuals from either party interfered, the one side to prevent, and the other to aid, in the robbery. Voices grew loud and angry, and 100 savages appeared, as it were by magic, where a dozen only had been seen a minute before. It was then that Cora saw the form of Magua gliding among his countrymen, and speaking with his fatal and artful eloquence. The mass of women and children stopped, and hovered together like alarmed and fluttering birds. But the cupidity of the Indian was soon gratified, and the different bodies again moved slowly onwards. The savages now fell back, and seemed content to let their enemies advance without further molestation. But as the female crowd approached them, the gaudy colours of a shawl attracted the eyes of a wild and untutored Huron. He advanced to seize it without the least hesitation. The woman, more in terror than through love of the ornament, wrapped her child in the coveted article, and folded both more closely to her bosom. Cora was in the act of speaking, with an intent to advise the woman to abandon the trifle, when the savage relinquished his hold of the shawl, and tore the screaming infant from her arms. Abandoning everything to the greedy grasp of those around her, the mother darted with distraction in her mien to reclaim her child. The Indian smiled grimly, and extended one hand in sign of a willingness to exchange, while with the other he flourished the babe above his head, holding it by the feet, as if to enhance the value of the ransom. "Here, here, there, all, any, everything!" exclaimed the breathless woman, tearing the lighter articles of dress from her person with ill-directed and trembling fingers. "Take all, but give me my babe!" The savage spurned the worthless rags, and perceiving that the shawl had already become a prize to another, his bantering but sullen smile changing to a gleam of ferocity, he dashed the head of the infant against a rock, and cast its quivering remains to her very feet. For an instant the mother stood like a statue of despair, looking wildly down at the unseemly object which had so lately nestled in her bosom and smiled in her face, and then she raised her eyes and countenance towards heaven, as if calling on God to curse the perpetrator of the foul deed. She was spared the sin of such a prayer, for, maddened at his disappointment, and excited by the sight of blood, the Huron mercifully drove his tomahawk into her own brain. The mother sank under the blow, and fell, grasping at her child in death with the same engrossing love that had caused her to cherish it when living. At that dangerous moment Magua placed his hands to his mouth, and raised the fatal and appalling whoop. The scattered Indians started at the well-known cry, as coursers bound at the signal to quit the goal, and directly there arose such a yell along the plain and through the arches of the wood as seldom burst from human lips before. They who heard it listened with a curdling horror at the heart, little inferior to that dread which may be expected to attend the blasts of the final summons. More than 2,000 raging savages broke from the forests at the signal, and threw themselves across the fatal plain with instinctive alacrity. We shall not dwell on the revolting horrors that succeeded. Death was everywhere, and in his most terrific and disgusting aspects. Resistance only served to inflame the murderers, who inflicted their furious blows long after their victims were beyond the power of their resentment. The flow of blood might be likened to the outbreaking of a torrent, and as the natives became heated and maddened by the sight, many among them even knelt to the earth and drank freely, exultingly, hellishly, of the crimson tide. The trained bodies of the troops threw themselves quickly into solid masses, endeavoring to awe their assailants by the imposing appearance of a military front. The experiment in some measure succeeded, though far too many suffered their unloaded muskets to be torn from their hands in the vain hope of appeasing the savages. In such a scene none had leisure to note the fleeting moments. It might have been 10 minutes, it seemed an age, that the sisters had stood riveted to one spot, horror-stricken and nearly helpless. When the first blow was struck, their screaming companions had pressed upon them in a body, rendering flight impossible, and now that fear or death had scattered most, if not all, from around them, they saw no avenue open but such as conducted to the tomahawks of their foes. On every side arose shrieks, groans, exhortations, and curses. At this moment Alice caught a glimpse of the vast form of her father, moving rapidly across the plain in the direction of the French army. He was, in truth, proceeding to Montcalm, fearless of every danger, to claim the tardy escort for which he had before conditioned. 50 glittering axes and barbed spears were offered unheeded at his life, but the savages respected his rank and calmness, even in their fury. The dangerous weapons were brushed aside by the still nervous arm of the veteran, or fell off themselves, after menacing an act that it would seem no one had courage to perform. Fortunately, the vindictive Magua was searching for his victim in the very band the veteran had just quitted. "Father, father, we are here!" shrieked Alice, as he passed, at no great distance, without appearing to heed them. "Come to us, father, or we die!" The cry was repeated, and in terms and tones that might have melted a heart of stone, but it was unanswered. Once, indeed, the old man appeared to catch the sounds, for he paused and listened, but Alice had dropped senseless on the earth, and Cora had sunk at her side, hovering in untiring tenderness over her lifeless form. Munro shook his head in disappointment, and proceeded, bent on the high duty of his station. "Lady," said Gamut, who, helpless and useless as he was, had not yet dreamt of deserting his trust, "it is the jubilee of the devils, and this is not a meet place for Christians to tarry in. Let us up and fly." "Go," said Cora, still gazing at her unconscious sister. "Save thyself. To me thou canst not be of further use." David comprehended the unyielding character of her resolution by the simple but expressive gesture that accompanied her words. He gazed for a moment at the dusky forms that were acting their hellish rites on every side of him, and his tall person grew more erect, while his chest heaved and every feature swelled, and seemed to speak with the power of the feelings by which he was governed. If the Jewish boy might tame the evil spirit of Saul by the sound of his harp and the words of sacred song, it may not be amiss, he said, to try the potency of music here. Then, raising his voice to its highest tones, he poured out a strain so powerful as to be heard even amid the din of that bloody field. More than one savage rushed towards them, thinking to rifle the unprotected sisters of their attire and bear away their scalps. But when they found this strange and unmoved figure riveted to his post, they paused to listen. Astonishment soon changed to admiration, and they passed on to other and less courageous victims, openly expressing their satisfaction at the firmness with which the white warrior sang his death song. Encouraged and deluded by his success, David exerted all his powers to extend what he believed so holy an influence. The unwonted sounds caught the ears of a distant savage, who flew raging from group to group like one who, scorning to touch the vulgar herd, hunted for some victim more worthy of his renown. It was Magua, who uttered a yell of pleasure when he beheld his ancient prisoners again at his mercy. "Come," he said, laying his soiled hand on the dress of Cora, "the wigwam of the Huron is still open. Is it not better than this place?" "Away!" cried Cora, veiling her eyes from his revolting aspect. The Indian laughed tauntingly as he held up his reeking hand and answered, "It is red, but it comes from white veins. Monster, there is blood, oceans of blood, upon thy soul. Thy spirit has moved this scene." "Magua is a great chief," returned the exulting savage. "Will the dark hair go to his tribe?" "Never. Strike if thou wilt, and complete thy revenge." He hesitated a moment, and then, catching the light and senseless form of Alice in his arms, the subtle Indian moved swiftly across the plain towards the woods. "Hold!" shrieked Cora, following wildly on his footsteps. "Release the child! Wretch! What is it you do?" But Magua was deaf to her voice, or rather he knew his power, and was determined to maintain it. "Stay, lady, stay!" called Gamut after the unconscious Cora. "The holy charm is beginning to be felt, and soon shalt thou see this horrid tumult stilled." Perceiving that in his turn he was unheeded, the faithful David followed the distracted sister, raising his voice again in sacred song, and sweeping the air to the measure with his long arm in diligent accompaniment. In this manner they traversed the plain, through the flying, the wounded, and the dead. The fierce Huron was at any time sufficient for himself and the victim that he bore, though Cora would have fallen more than once under the blows of her savage enemies, but for the extraordinary being who stalked in her rear, and who now appeared to the astonished natives gifted with a protecting spirit of madness. Magua, who knew how to avoid the more pressing dangers, and also to elude pursuit, entered the woods through a low ravine, where he quickly found the Narragansetts, which the travellers had abandoned so shortly before, awaiting his appearance in custody of a savage as fierce and as malign in his expression as himself. Laying Alice on one of the horses, he made a sign for Cora to mount the other. Notwithstanding the horror excited by the presence of her captor, there was a present relief in escaping from the bloody scene enacting on the plain, to which Cora could not be altogether insensible. She took her seat, and held forth her arms for her sister with an air of entreaty and love that even the Huron could not deny. Placing Alice then on the same animal with Cora, he seized the bridle, and commenced his route by plunging deeper into the forest. David, perceiving he was left alone, utterly disregarded, as a subject too worthless even to destroy, threw his long limb across the saddle of the beast they had deserted, and made such progress in the pursuit as the difficulties of the path permitted. They soon began to ascend, but as the motion had tendency to revive the dormant faculties of her sister, the attention of Cora was too much divided between the tenderest solicitude in her behalf, and in listening to the cries which were still too audible on the plain, to note the direction in which they journeyed. When, however, they gained the flattened surface of the mountain top, and approached the eastern precipice, she recognized the spot to which she had once before been led under the more friendly auspices of the scout. Here Magua suffered them to dismount, and notwithstanding their own captivity, the curiosity which seems inseparable from horror induced them to gaze at the sickening sight below. The cruel work was still unchecked. On every side the captured were flying before their relentless persecutors, while the armed columns of the Christian king stood fast in an apathy which has never been explained, and which has left an immovable blot on the otherwise fair escutcheon of their leader. Nor was the sword of death stayed until cupidity got the mastery of revenge. Then, indeed, the shrieks of the wounded and the yells of their murderers grew less frequent, until finally the cries of horror were lost to their ear, or were drowned in the loud, long, and piercing whoops of the triumphant savages. Note. The accounts of the number who fell in this unhappy affair vary between 5 and 1,500. End of chapter 17.
This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Eric Wisdahl, Gainesville, Florida. The Last of the Mohicans by James Fenimore Cooper. Chapter 18.
Why anything? An honorable murder, if you will, for naught I did in hate, but all in honor. Othello.
The bloody and inhuman scene rather incidentally mentioned than described in the preceding chapter is conspicuous in the pages of colonial history by the merited title of The Massacre of William Henry. It so far deepened the stain which a previous and very similar event had left upon the reputation of the French commander that it was not entirely erased by his early and glorious death. It is now becoming obscured by time, and thousands who know that Montcalm died like a hero on the plains of Abraham have yet to learn how much he was deficient in that moral courage without which no man can be truly great. Pages might yet be written to prove, from his illustrious example, the defects of human excellence, to show how easy it is for generous sentiments, high courtesy, and chivalrous courage to lose their influence beneath the chilling blight of selfishness, and to exhibit to the world a man who is great in all the minor attributes of character, but who was found wanting when it became necessary to prove how much principle is superior to policy. But the task would exceed our prerogatives, and, as history, like love, is so apt to surround her heroes with an atmosphere of imaginary brightness, it is probable that Louis de Saint Véran will be viewed by posterity only as the gallant defender of his country, while his cruel apathies on the shore of the Oswego and of the Huron will be forgotten. Deeply regretting this weakness on the part of a sister muse, we shall at once retire from her sacred precincts within the proper limits of our own humble vocation. The third day from the capture of the fort was drawing to a close, but the business of the narrative must still detain the reader on the shores of the Holy Lake. When last seen, the environs of the work were filled with violence and uproar. They were now possessed by stillness and death. The blood-stained conquerors had departed, and their camp, which had so lately rung with the merry rejoicings of a victorious army, lay a silent and deserted city of huts. The fortress was a smoldering ruin. Charred rafters, fragments of exploded artillery, and rent masonwork covered its earthen mounds in confused disorder. A frightful change had also occurred in the season. The sun had hid its warmth behind an impenetrable mass of vapor, and hundreds of human forms, which had blackened beneath the fierce heat of August, were stiffening in their deformity before the blasts of a premature November. The curling and spotless mist, which had been seen sailing above the hills towards the north, were now returning in an interminable dusky sheet that was urged along by the fury of a tempest. The crowded mirror of the hurricane was gone, and, in its place, the green and angry waters lashed the shores, as if indignantly casting back its impurities to the polluted strand. Still the clear fountain retained a portion of its charmed influence, but it reflected only the somber gloom that fell from the impending heavens. That humid and congenial atmosphere which commonly adorned the view, veiling its harshness and softening its asperities, had disappeared. The northern air poured across the waste of waters so harsh and unmingled that nothing was left to be conjectured by the eye, or fashioned by fancy. The fiercer element had cropped the verdure of the plain, which looked as though it were scathed by the consuming lightning, but here and there a dark green tuft rose in the midst of the desolation, the earliest fruits of a soil that had been fattened with human blood. The whole landscape, which, seen by a favoring light and in a genial temperature, had been found so lovely, appeared now like some pictured allegory of life, in which objects were arrayed in their harshest but truest colors, and without the relief of any shadowing. The solitary and arid blades of grass arose from the passing gusts fearfully perceptible. The bold and rocky mountains were too distinct in their barrenness, and the eye even sought relief, in vain, by attempting to pierce the illimitable void of heaven, which was shut to its gaze by the dusky sheet of ragged and driving vapor. The wind blew unequally, sometimes sweeping heavily along the ground, seeming to whisper its moanings in the cold ears of the dead, then rising in a shrill and mournful whistling. It entered the forest with a rush that filled the air with the leaves and branches it scattered in its path. Amid the unnatural shower, a few hungry ravens struggled with the gale, but no sooner was the green ocean of woods which stretched beneath them past than they gladly stopped at random to their hideous banquet. In short, it was a scene of wildness and desolation, and it appeared as if all who had profanely entered it had been stricken, at a blow, by the relentless arm of death. But the prohibition had ceased, and for the first time since the preparators of those foul deeds which had assisted to disfigure the scene were gone, living human beings had now presumed to approach the place. About an hour before the setting of the sun, on the day already mentioned, the forms of 5 men might have been seen issuing from the narrow vista of trees, where the path to the Hudson entered the forest, and advancing in the direction of the ruined works. At first their progress was slow and guarded, as though they entered with reluctance amid the horrors of the post, or dreaded the renewal of its frightened insolence. A light figure preceded the rest of the party, with the caution and activity of a native, ascending every hillock to reconnoitre, and indicating by gestures to his companions the route he deemed it most prudent to pursue. Nor were those in the rear wanting in every caution and foresight known to forest warfare. One among them, he alone was an Indian, moved a little on one flank and watched the margin of the woods, with eyes long accustomed to read the smallest sign of danger. The remaining 3 were white, though clad in vestments adapted, both in quality and color, to their present hazardous pursuit, that of hanging on the skirts of a retiring army in the wilderness. The effects produced by the appalling sights that constantly arose in their path to the lake shore were as different as the characters of the respective individuals who composed the party. The youth in front threw serious but furtive glances at the mangled victims as he stepped lightly across the plain, afraid to exhibit his feelings, and yet too inexperienced to quell entirely their sudden and powerful influence. His red associate, however, was superior to such weakness. He passed the groups of dead with a steadiness of purpose and an eye so calm that nothing but long and inveterate practice could enable him to maintain. The sensations produced in the minds of even the white men were different, though uniformly sorrowful. One, whose grey locks and furrowed lineaments blended with a martial air and tread, betrayed, in spite of the disguise of woodman's dress, a man long experienced in scenes of war, was not ashamed to groan aloud whenever a spectacle of more than usual horror came under his view. The young man at his elbow shuddered, but seemed to suppress his feelings in tenderness to his companion. Of them all, the straggler who brought up the rear appeared alone to betray his real thoughts, without fear of observation or dread of consequences. He gazed at the most appalling sight with eyes and muscles that knew not how to waver, but with execrations so bitter and deep as to denote how much he denounced the crime of his enemies. The reader will perceive at once, in these respective characters, the Mohicans and their white friend the scout, together with Munro and Heyward. It was, in truth, the father in quest of his children, attended by the youth who felt so deep a stake in their happiness, and those brave and trustworthy foresters, who had already proved their skill and fidelity through the trying scenes related. When Uncas, who moved in the front, had reached the center of the plain, he raised a cry that drew his companions in a body to the spot. The young warrior had halted over a group of females who lay in a cluster, a confused mass of dead. Notwithstanding the revolting horror of the exhibition, Munro and Heyward flew towards the festering heap, endeavoring, with a love that no unseemliness could extinguish, to discover whether any vestiges of those they sought were to be seen among the tattered and many-colored garments. The father and the lover found instant relief in the search, though each was condemned again to experience the misery of an uncertainty that was hardly less insupportable than the most revolting truth. They were standing, silent and thoughtful, around the melancholy pile when the scout approached. Eyeing the sad spectacle with an angry countenance, the sturdy woodsman, for the first time since his entering the plain, spoke intelligibly and aloud.
"I have been on many a shocking field, and have followed a trail of blood for weary miles," he said, "but never have I found the hand of the devil so plain as it is here to be seen. Revenge is an Indian feeling, and all who know me know that there is no cross in my veins. But this much will I say, here, in the face of heaven, and with the power of the Lord so manifest in this howling wilderness, that should these Frenchers ever trust themselves again within the range of a ragged bullet, there is one rifle which shall play its part so long as flint will fire or powder burn. I leave the tomahawk and knife to such as have a natural gift to use them. What say you, Chingachgook?" he added, in Delaware. "Shall the Hurons boast of this to their women when the deep snows come?"
A gleam of resentment flashed across the dark lineaments of the Mohican chief. He loosened his knife in its sheath, and then, turning calmly from the sight, his countenance settled into a repose as deep as if he knew the instigation of passion. Montcalm," continued the deeply resentful and less self-restrained scout. "They say a time must come when all the deeds done in the flesh will be seen at a single look, and that by eyes cleared from mortal infirmities. Woe betide that wretch who is born to behold this plain, with the judgment hanging about his soul. Ha! As I am a man of white blood, yonder lies a redskin, without the hair of his head where nature rooted it. Look to him, Delaware. It may be one of your missing people, and he should have burial like a stout warrior. I see it in your eyes, Sagamore. A Huron pays for this, for the fall winds have blown away the scent of the blood." Chingachgook approached the mutilated form, and, turning it over, he found the distinguishing marks of one of those 6 allied tribes, or nations, as they were called, who, while they fought in the English ranks, were so deadly hostile to his own people. Spurning the loathsome object with his foot, he turned from it with the same indifference he would have quitted a brute carcass. The scout comprehended the action, and very deliberately pursued his own way, continuing, however, his denunciations against the French commander in the same resentful strain. "Nothing but vast wisdom and unlimited power should dare to sweep off men in multitudes," he added, "for it is only that one that can know the necessity of the judgment. And what is there, short of the other, that can replace the creatures of the Lord? I hold it a sin to kill the second buck afore the first is eaten, unless a march in front or an ambushment be contemplated. It is a different matter with few warriors in open, rugged fight, for 'tis their gift to die with the rifle or the tomahawk in hand, accordingly as their natures may happen to be, white or red. Uncas, come this way, lad, and let the ravens settle upon the Mingo. I know, from often seeing it, that they have a craving for the flesh of an Oneida, and it is as well to let the bird follow the gift of its natural appetite." "Huh!" exclaimed the young Mohican, rising on the extremities of his feet, gazing intently in his front, frightening the ravens to some other prey by the sound and the action. "What is it, boy?" whispered the cat, lowering his tall form into a crouching attitude, like a panther about to take his leap. "Odd send it be a tardy Frencher skulking for plunder. I do believe Killdeer would take an uncommon range today." Uncas, without making any reply, bounded away from the spot, and in the next instant he was seen tearing from a bush, and waving in triumph a fragment of the green riding veil of Cora. The movement, the exhibition, and the cry which again burst from the lips of the young Mohican instantly drew the whole party about him. "My child," said Munro, speaking quickly and wildly,
Give me my child." "Uncas will try," was the short and touching answer. The simple but meaning assurance was lost on the father, who seized the piece of gauze and crushed it in his hand, while his eyes roamed fearfully among the bushes, as if he were equally dreaded and hoped for the secrets they might reveal. "Here are no dead," said Heyward. "The storm seems not to have passed this way." "That's manifest, and cleared the heavens about our heads," returned the undisturbed scout. "But either she or they that have robbed her have passed the bush, for I remember the rag she wore to hide her face that all did love to look upon. Uncas, you are right. The dark-haired has been here, and she has fled like a frightened fawn to the wood. None who could fly would remain to be murdered. Let us search for the marks she left, for, to Indian eyes, I sometimes think a hunting-bird leaves his trail in the air." The young Mohican darted away at the suggestion, and the scout had hardly done speaking before the former raised a cry of success from the margin of the forest. On reaching the spot, the anxious party perceived another portion of the veil fluttering on the lower branch of a beech. "Softly, softly," said the scout, extending his long rifle in front of the eager Heyward. "We now know our work, but the beauty of the trail must not be deformed. A step too soon may give us hours of trouble. We have them, though. That much is beyond denial." Bless ye, worthy man. Whither, then, have they fled, and where are my babes?" "The path they have taken depends on many chances. If they have gone on alone, they are quite as likely to move in a circle as straight, and they may be within a dozen miles of us. But if the Hurons, or any of the French Indians, have laid hands on them, 'tis probably they are now near the borders of the Canadas. But what matters that?" continued the deliberate scout, observing the powerful anxiety and the disappointment the listeners exhibited. "Here are the Mohicans nigh on one end of the trail, and, rely on it, we find the other, though they should be 100 leagues asunder. Gently, gently, Uncas. You are as impatient as a man in the settlements. You forget that light feet leave but faint marks." "Huh!" exclaimed Chingachgook, who had been occupied in examining an opening that had been evidently made through the low underbrush which skirted the forest, and who now stood erect, as he pointed downward, in the attitude and with the air of a man who beheld a disgusting serpent. "Here is the palpable impression of the footsteps of a man," cried Heyward, bending over the indicated spot. "He is trod in the margin of this pool, and the mark cannot be mistaken. They are captives." "Better so than left to starve in the wilderness," returned the scout. "And they will leave a wider trail. I would wager 50 beaver skins against as many flints that the Mohicans and I enter their wigwams within the month. Stoop to it, Uncas, and try what you can make of the moccasin, for moccasin it plainly is, and no shoe." The young Mohican bent over the track, and, removing the scattered leaves from around the place, he examined it with much of that sort of scrutiny that a money dealer, in these days of pecuniary doubts, would bestow on a suspected due-bill. At length he arose from his knees, satisfied with the result of the examination. "Well, boy," demanded the attentive scout, "what does it say? Can you make anything of the telltale?" "Le renard subtil. Ah! That rampaging devil again! There will never be an end of his looping till Killdeer has said a friendly word to him." Heyward reluctantly admitted the truth of this intelligence, and now expressed rather his hopes than his doubts by saying, "One moccasin is so much like another, it is probable there is some mistake." "One moccasin like another! You may as well say that one foot is like another, though we all know that some are long and others short, some broad and others narrow, somewhat high and somewhat low in steps, some in-toed and some out. One moccasin is no more like another than one book is like another, though they who can read in one are seldom able to tell the marks of the other, which is all ordered from the best. giving to every man his natural advantages. Let me get down to it, Uncas. Neither book nor moccasin is the worse for having two opinions instead of one." The scout stooped to the task, and instantly added, "You're right, boy. Here's the patch we saw so often in the other chase, and the fellow will drink when he can get an opportunity. Your drinking Indian always learns to walk with wider toe the natural savage, it being the gift of a drunkard to straddle, whether of white or red skin. 'Tis just the length and breadth, too. Look at it, Sagamore. You measured the prints more than once, when we hunted the varmints from glens to the hell springs." Chingachgook complied, and after finishing his short examination, he arose, and with a quiet demeanor, he merely pronounced the word Magua. "'Tis a settled thing. Here, then, have passed the dark hair and Magua." "And not Alice?" demanded Heyward. "Of her we have not yet seen the signs," reported the scout, looking closely around at the trees, the bushes, and the ground. "What have we there? Uncas, bring hither the thing you see dangling from yonder thorn bush." When the Indian had complied, the scout received the prize, and, holding it on high, he laughed in a silent but heartfelt manner. "'Tis the tooting weapon of the singer. Now we shall have a trail a priest might travel," he said. "Uncas, look for the marks of a shoe that is long enough to uphold 6 feet 2 of tottering human flesh. I begin to have some hopes of the fellow, since he has given up squalling to follow some better trade." "At least he has been faithful to his trust," said Heyward, "and Cora and Alice are not without a friend." "Yes," said Hawkeye, dropping his rifle and leaning on it with an air of visible contempt. "He will do their singing. Can he slay a buck for their dinner, journey by the moss on the beaches, or cut the throat of a Huron? If not, the first catbird he meets is the cleverer of the two. Well, boy, any signs of such a foundation?"
Footnote: the powers of the American mockingbird are generally known, but the true mockingbird is not found so far north as the state of New York, where it has, however, two substitutes of inferior excellence, the catbird, so often named by the scout, and the bird vulgarly called ground thresher. Either of these last two birds is superior to the nightingale or the lark, though in general the American birds are less musical than those of Europe. End footnote.
"Here is something like the footsteps of one who has worn a shoe. Can it be that of our friend?" "Touch the leaves lightly, or you'll disconcert the formation. That is the print of a foot, but 'tis the dark hairs, and small it is, too, for one of such noble height and grand appearance. The singer would cover it with his heel." "Where? Let me look at the footsteps of my child," said Munro, shoving the bushes aside and bending fondly over the nearly obliterated impression. Though the tread which had left the mark had been light and rapid, it was still plainly visible. The aged soldier examined it with eyes that grew dim as he gazed, nor did he rise from this stooping posture until Heyward saw that he had watered the trace of his daughter's passage with a scalding tear. Willing to divert a distress which threatened each moment to break through to restraint of appearances, by giving the veteran something to do, the young man said to the scout, "As we now possess these infallible signs, let us commence our march. A moment at such a time will appear an age to the captives." "It is not the swiftest leaping deer that gives the longest chase," returned Hawkeye, without moving his eyes from the different marks that had come under his view. "We know that the rampaging Huron had passed, and the dark-haired, and the singer, but where is she of the yellow locks and blue eyes? Though little and far from being as bold as her sister, she is fair to the view and pleasant in discourse. Has she no friend, that none care for her? God forbid she should ever want hundreds. Are we not now in her pursuit? For one, I will never cease the search till she be found. In that case we may have to journey by different paths, for here she is not passed, light and little as her footsteps would be." Heyward drew back, all his ardor to proceed seeming to vanish on that instant. Without attending to the sudden change in the other's humor, the scout, after musing a moment, continued,
"There is no woman in this wilderness could leave such a print as that. But the dark-haired are his sister. We know that the first had been here, but where are the signs of the other? Let us push deeper on the trail, and if nothing offers, we must go back to the plain and strike another scent. Move on, Junkers. Keep your eyes on the dried leaves. I will watch the bushes while your father shall run with a low nose to the ground. Move on, friends. The sun is getting behind the hills."
"Is there nothing that I can do?" demanded the anxious Heyward.
"You?"
repeated the scouts, who, with his red friends, was already advancing in the order he had prescribed.
"Yes. You can keep in our rear and be careful not to cross the trail."
Before they had proceeded many rods, the Indians stopped, and appeared to gaze at some signs on the earth with more than their usual keenness. Both father and son spoke quickly and loud, now looking at the object of their mutual admiration, and now regarding each other with the most unequivocal pleasure.
"They have found the Littlefoot!"
exclaimed the scout, moving forward without attending further to his own portion of the duty.
"What have we here? An ambushment has been planted in the spot. No, by the truest rifle on the frontiers, here have been them one-sided horses again. Now the whole secret is out, and all is plain as the North Star at midnight. Yes, here they have mounted. There the beasts have been bound to a sapling and waiting, and yonder runs the broad path away to the north, in full sweep for the Canadas."
"But still there are no signs of Alice—of the younger Miss Monroe," said Duncan.
"Unless the shining bauble Uncas has just lifted from the ground should prove one. Pass it this way, lad, that we may look at it."
Heyward instantly knew it for a trinket that Alice was fond of wearing, and which he recollected, with the tenacious memory of a lover, to have seen on the fatal morning of the massacre, dangling from the fair neck of his mistress. He seized the highly prized jewel, and, as he proclaimed the fact, it vanished from the eyes of the wandering scout, who in vain looked for it on the ground, long after it was warmly pressed against the beating heart of Duncan.
"Pshaw!"
said the disappointed Hawkeye, ceasing to rake the leaves with the breech of his rifle.
"'Tis a certain sign of age, when the sight begins to weaken. Such a glittering gewgaw not to be seen. Well, well, I can squint along a clouded barrel yet. That is enough to settle all disputes between me and the Mingos. I should like to find the thing, too, if it were only to carry it to the right owner. That would be bringing the two ends of what I call a long trail together, for by this time the broad St. Lawrence, or perhaps the Great Lakes themselves, are between us."
"So much the more reason why we should not delay our march," returned Heyward. "Let us proceed."
"Young blood and hot blood, they say, are much the same thing. We are not about to start on a squirrel hunt or to drive a deer into the Horican, but to outlie for days and nights, and to stretch across a wilderness where the feet of men seldom go, and where no bookish knowledge would carry you through harmless. An Indian never starts on such an expedition without smoking over his council fire, and, though a man of white blood, I honor their customs in this particular, seeing that they are deliberate and wise. We will, therefore, go back and light our fire tonight in the ruins of the old fort, and in the morning we shall be fresh and ready to undertake our work like men, and not like babbling women or eager boys."
Heyward saw, by the manner of the scout, that altercation would be useless. Monroe had again sunk into the sort of apathy which had beset him since his late overwhelming misfortunes, and from which he was apparently to be roused only by some new and powerful excitement. Making a merit of necessity, the young man took the veteran by the arm, and followed in the footsteps of the Indians and the scout, who had already begun to retrace the path which conducted them to the plain. End of chapter 18.